Today, I'm going to share 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I will share the photo that is famously associated with that story.
But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace all of the like button's toilet paper with duct tape. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 1 p.m. on November 2nd, 2020, an older man named Marcel Terray stood in his backyard hanging damp clothes on a clothesline. Marcel and his wife, 83-year-old Paulette Landru, lived on a quiet street in the small city of Anden, Belgium. And usually, their days were filled with household chores or visits from their kids. But over the last few months, Marcel had started to spend a lot more time taking care of his wife because she had recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia that causes memory loss and confusion. And so Paulette needed help remembering to eat or to take her medications on time. And sometimes she would just wander off without telling Marcel, and Marcel would have to go corral her and bring her back home. For Marcel, watching his wife struggle with this disease was absolutely heartbreaking, and so he did everything in his power to make her life as comfortable and happy as he possibly could. And so before he had come out to hang up the laundry, he had made sure to set his wife up in front of the TV with a nice lunch so she could eat and watch her favorite show. And so Marcel hung up the last piece of clothing and then picked up the empty laundry basket and headed back towards the house. When he went inside, he expected to see his wife still sitting on the couch watching TV. But she wasn't there anymore. Marcel immediately began calling out his wife's name, but she didn't call back. And then he searched the whole house and he couldn't find her. And so starting to panic, he went outside, he searched the outside of the house, she wasn't there. He even knocked on some neighbors' doors, but they hadn't seen her. And so at this point, Marcel was very scared given the fact that his wife had Alzheimer's and could easily wander off and put herself in a very dangerous situation without even knowing. And so instead of waiting any longer to just hope she showed up again, he picked up the phone and he called the police. Less than an hour later, Marcel stood outside of his house looking at helicopters flying overhead, and he knew at least half a dozen officers were spread out around the neighborhood, knocking on neighbors' doors. There were canine units searching the surrounding area. This huge search, it was all for Paulette. Marcel was glad to see that clearly the police had taken the search very seriously, and so he was confident that they would find his wife and that hopefully she'd be okay. But the hours kept ticking by, and as the sun began to go down, there still was no sign of Paulette. A police officer told Marcel that they would keep on investigating and hopefully find his wife as soon as possible. But over the next few days and weeks, Paulette didn't turn up, nobody had any idea where she was, and before long, weeks turned into months, and then months turned into 2 full years that nobody had seen Paulette. And by that point, Marcel had basically resigned himself to the fact that he very likely would die without ever figuring out what happened to his wife. But then, one day in early October of 2022, so 2 years after Paulette went missing, one of Marcel and Paulette's neighbors was at home on their computer looking at a particular website. And as they were scrolling through this website, they happened upon an image that as soon as they saw it, they froze. Because this neighbor was very well aware of the fact that Paulette had gone missing and nobody had found her. But now they're seeing this image on this website that basically gives away what happened to her. And so totally shocked that they had even found this image, the neighbor screenshotted it and brought it to the police. So it would turn out that neighbor was looking at Google Street View, which is a feature of Google Maps that basically allows you to see 360-degree views of basically anywhere on the planet. To create these images, Google literally sends out these special vehicles all over the world that have cameras that sit on top of the cars. And these cars drive down basically all the streets all over the place, constantly taking pictures all around them. And it just so happened on the exact day that Paulette went missing in 2020, there happened to be a Google car driving down the road that captured a picture of her. And so as you can see in the picture of her, you see Paulette on the left side of the image walking across the street away from her home, which is on the right side. And on the right side, you can actually see Marcel in the backyard hanging up laundry on the clothesline. And so the police, after getting this image, they basically followed the projected route Paulette was on, which is basically beelining straight across the road. And they found that across the street was this steep hill that led down to this thick bramble bush. and inside of that bramble bush was Paulette, and she was deceased. And so very likely, Paulette, in her confused state, walked straight across the street, as we see in the image, and then fell down that hill and got trapped at the bottom inside of that bramble bush and couldn't move. And so when that huge search for her was going on, very likely she was just trapped down there, but didn't understand what was going on, couldn't necessarily yell up to communicate with anybody, and so she stayed down there and died. And unfortunately, it would take 2 more full years and a random image on Google Street View before Marcel could finally get the closure he needed.
Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. I've talked a lot about how therapy really helped me when I left the military in 2017. It took time, but I went from being this very angry person who was struggling with depression to feeling like I was at peace and content again. And today, part of the reason I still consider myself to be very well adjusted is because of the skills I have learned in therapy. The most important skill that I find myself leaning on most days is self-awareness, something I definitely lacked pre-therapy. Now I'm very in tune with how I feel and how it affects me personally, but also how it affects the people around me. Like, my mood and behavior can have an enormous effect on my friends and family, and I need to be aware of that. And so that self-awareness kind of keeps me from spiraling when I start to struggle. So while therapy is certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution, I do think it's a great starting point for anybody who's struggling. And while therapy can be costly, there are affordable options, such as online therapy platforms like BetterHelp. BetterHelp is on a mission to make starting therapy easier. All you have to do is fill out a quick questionnaire, and then you'll be paired up with a licensed BetterHelp therapist within a couple of days. One of the best features of BetterHelp is that if the first therapist does not feel like the right fit, you can continue to switch therapists until you find someone you really connect with, and it's at no additional cost. So really, BetterHelp is trying to find the right person for you. So if you're struggling right now and you think you might benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month of therapy. Okay, back to the story.
Around 10 a.m. on July 26, 2015, a 31-year-old mom named Xiang Lu Xuan and her husband chased their 2-year-old son around a brand new indoor playground. This playground was on the 6th floor of a mall in Jingzhou City, which is in central China. And so Xiang and her husband had come to this mall today just so their son could basically enjoy this playground. And currently he was running around in circles and laughing hysterically. He thought it was great. Xiang caught up to her son and scooped him up and then placed him at the top of a slide. And he happily slid down to the bottom, and when he reached the bottom, Xiang was waiting for him, and the son, he just stopped and looked past her and pointed and started saying, "Ride, ride." And so Xiang, she turned around and she saw right behind them were these 2 escalators, one going up and one going down. And so Xiang realized her son clearly thought these escalators were maybe a part of this playground. And so he wanted to go use them. They were a fun attraction. And so Xiang smiled and took her son's hand and then told her husband they're going to go ride the ride, the escalators. And then they began walking over. Once Xiang and her son actually reached the escalator, suddenly her son was not as keen to hop on board. He was nervous. But Xiang, who had ridden escalators many times before, told her son it's totally safe, and she kind of coaxed him to do it, and eventually he stepped on right alongside her, holding her hand, and about halfway up the escalator, when she was confident her son would be okay, Xiang turned around and looked up towards the top of the escalator, the 7th floor where they were going. And she saw 3 mall employees at the top of the escalator on the 7th floor where they were going. And they were clearly looking at Xiang with a very serious look on their faces, and they were gesturing at something towards the top of the escalator. It seemed like they could be warning her about something or simply pointing something out. She wasn't really sure. And so she looked up at them like, what's going on here? But the 3 mall employees just didn't do a good job communicating whatever was going on or whatever issue they were dealing with. And so as a result, Xiang and her son just continued riding up the escalator, and as they got closer and closer, these mall employees continued to gesture at something happening on the 7th floor just beyond the escalator, and Xiang still totally confused. And then finally, when Xiang and her son reached the top and stepped off, Xiang suddenly understood what these employees were referencing. But by now, it was too late. Moments later, Jiang's husband, who was still down below on the 6th floor at the playground, he heard the sound of his wife and son screaming over near the escalator. And so instinctively, he bolted over to the escalator. He didn't see his wife, didn't see his son, and he began going up the escalator when someone at the top screamed at him to stop and get off the escalator. And so he did. And right then, a mall employee came running down the other side carrying his son. And this person handed the son over to Jiang's husband. And this employee, who clearly was completely shocked by whatever had happened up above, just shook their head. It would turn out, earlier that day, those mall employees who were at the top gesturing to Jiang, they had discovered a defect with the metal platform that sits right at the top of the escalator on the 7th floor. Basically, when you get off this escalator, it's the platform you step onto first. They had found there was something wrong with it. It wasn't stable. But instead of immediately blocking off the escalator to make sure nobody walked on it and then go get it repaired, these employees just kind of nonchalantly allowed the escalator to continue, stationed a couple of them at the top to make sure nobody, used the escalator, and then called for a repairman. But the repairman hadn't shown up and fixed this problem by the time Jiang and her son boarded the escalator. And these employees at the top knew there's this huge issue with the platform they're going to step on the second they get off, but they failed to communicate the danger to Jiang and her son as they were coming up. They just kind of broadly gesticulated that there was some issue up here and to sort of watch out for it, but Jiang had no idea. And so by the time she got to the top and stepped off the escalator onto that platform, well, the defect with the platform is that it caved in with any weight. And so she fell into the escalator, where the teeth of the escalator was rotating, and as she was getting pulled in to her death, her final moment captured on video as she took her son and thrusted him to the employees, saving his life before she disappeared and died inside the inner workings of the escalator. Following Jiang's death, there was a full-scale investigation, and quickly there were massive safety failures identified on the part of the company who made the escalator and also on the mall itself. 2 people were ultimately arrested in connection with Jiang's death and these safety failures, and the mall reportedly offered to pay some settlement to Jiang's family. However, the details of that settlement have not been made public. One morning in November of 1997, a police captain named Jeffrey Lewis, along with his partner, parked their squad car near the Manatee River in Bradenton, Florida, which is a small city just south of Tampa. A few minutes earlier, the Bradenton Police Department had received a call from this frantic man who had said he had found something suspicious that had washed up on the shore of this river. And so Captain Lewis and his partner were there to investigate. And so as soon as they got out of their squad car, this man who had called the police, he saw them and waved them down, and he was pointing at something in the sand. And so Captain Lewis and his partner, they walked over, and before they even talked to this guy, they just looked down at what he was pointing at, and right away they could see why he called the police. Because there, sitting on the sand, was a severed human hand. And so the instant Captain Lewis saw this, his first thought was actually just alligators, because there were alligators that swam in the Manatee River, and people were told about them and were told, not to go swimming here, but people still did. And so his thought was, well, maybe one of the alligators got a swimmer. However, when Captain Lewis looked at the hand more closely, he could tell right away that that probably did not happen, because where the hand had been cut off from the body, the cut was almost surgical. It was very, very neat, whereas if an alligator had ripped the hand off, it would be rough. But this almost looked like a surgeon had carefully removed the hand. And so what this signaled to Captain Lewis is this hand very likely represented a murder victim. Somebody who killed this person, cut their body up, and one of their body parts is now washed ashore. And so Captain Lewis turned to his partner and told him to call for backup. And within an hour, police officers were scouring the Manatee River looking for the body that belonged to this hand. Meanwhile, the captain bagged this hand as evidence and brought it to the county sheriff's crime lab, hoping that forensic experts could potentially figure out who the victim was using fingerprints. However, when he actually handed over the hand to these forensic technicians, they told Captain Lewis that it was very likely going to be impossible to try to pull prints from this hand because the hand was very badly decomposed and water damaged. But they told Captain Lewis that despite this being a total long shot, they would still give it a try. And so really all Captain Lewis had was this hand, and so he just kind of waited for information from the crime lab about the fingerprints. And before long, the waiting went from days to weeks to months with no fingerprints. And so with no fingerprints and no other breakthroughs in this case, Captain Lewis moved on to other cases. That is, until June of 1998, when Captain Lewis was sitting in his office doing some work, when he suddenly got a call from the crime lab about the hand. An employee told Captain Lewis they had finally made a breakthrough. When they couldn't get the prints off this hand at first, they had moved to this very complicated technique where basically they would peel individual layers of skin off the hand and sort of piece together all the information to get a print. And amazingly, this technique worked. And so not only did they now have this print, but they had also already run this print through the Florida State database, and they had gotten a match. The hand belonged to a man named Willie Suttle. As soon as he hung up, Captain Lewis opened up a new tab on his computer and began researching Willie Suttle to figure out who this person was. And he quickly found through public employment records that Willie had been a retired garbage collector, and then also Captain Lewis looked at police records and discovered that Willie had a minor criminal history. But what really stood out in his research about Willie was that Willie had never been reported missing. Willie had instead been reported dead. Right there in the public records that Captain Lewis was looking at, he found Willie's death certificate. And this document said Willie had died of natural causes 5 months prior to his hand washing up on shore. And also it said Willie had been buried in a local cemetery, and no police had ever been involved in his death because no crime had been committed. And so Captain Lewis was baffled. None of this made any sense. If Willie had died of natural causes and been buried over a year ago, then how did his hand, his severed hand, wind up on the shore of the Manatee River? The next day, which was Friday, June 26th, Captain Lewis, along with a few other police officers, went to the cemetery where Willie had been buried, and they exhumed his casket. And when they opened it up, they actually expected it to be empty, considering his hand was already missing, so probably his whole body was gone. But no, when they opened it up, there was Willie, missing his left hand. But that wasn't all. At the bottom of Willie's casket were all of his internal organs, just sitting there in a rotting pile. And so Captain Lewis is staring at this, having no idea what to make of it. But the first thought he had was, okay, maybe somebody tried to rob Willie's casket. But he's thinking, if they did that, why did they cut out his organs and stash them at the bottom of the casket? And also, why did they remove his left hand and chuck it in the river? Like, that doesn't make any sense. It felt like every clue Captain Lewis found was only making this case harder to solve. But he hoped when he sent off Willie's body to the county medical examiner that they would be able to provide him with some more answers as to what happened here. Later that afternoon, the county medical examiner would perform an autopsy on Willie's body. And the first thing he noticed when he began was that despite the fact that Willie's organs clearly had been removed, that Willie's abdomen did not appear sunken in. It appeared full. So the medical examiner started the autopsy by cutting open Willie's abdomen to see what was in there. And when he saw what was inside of Willie, he just froze, having no idea how to react to what he was looking at. He had never seen anything like this in his entire career, not even close. And so the medical examiner just grabbed a camera, took some pictures of Willie's midsection, and sent those pictures to Captain Lewis. The next day, Captain Lewis sat inside of an interview room in the police station across from a 45-year-old woman named Paula Green Albritton. Paula owned and operated a funeral home along with the help of her son, and she had been the one responsible for Willie Suttle's burial. And so Captain Lewis asked Paula about Willie's burial, and she would tell him that Willie had actually died in poverty, without any family members to help cover his burial expenses. However, when Paula had found out about this, she said she had agreed to do the burial anyways, for no cost, as sort of a community service. However, when Captain Lewis poked and prodded and tried to ask for more information about exactly what that meant, Paula would eventually concede that there actually was slightly more to her rationale behind wanting to do Willie's burial. It was not just for charity. 2 days after this interview, police arrested both Paula and her son. And at Paula's trial, the truth surrounding what happened to Willie finally came out. It would turn out Paula's funeral home business was really struggling, to the point where if she couldn't start generating some real money, her business might go under. And she couldn't have that. And so Paula decided she would conduct a prosperity ritual to right her business. But to perform this prosperity ritual, Paula needed a body. And so along comes Willie Suttle, who's died in poverty and his family can't afford his funeral. And Paula says, don't worry, I'll take him on for free. But really what she needed was Willie's body. And once Paula and her son had possession of Willie's body, they began the ritual, which started with Paula's son carefully cutting off Willie's left hand, and then the two of them cut Willie's midsection open, removed all his internal organs, and then Paula got out all these voodoo dolls, and she wrote on pieces of paper the names of the other funeral homes, her competitors in the area, and she pinned these pieces of paper to each of these voodoo dolls, and then she took those voodoo dolls and jammed them inside of Willie's abdomen in the empty cavity they had created, and then they stitched him back up. And then she took Willie's body and his organs, and she chucked them into a cheap casket and had him buried. And then she also took the hand that her son had removed, she put it inside of a plastic bag, added some weight to it, and chucked it into the Manatee River. Paula believed this voodoo ritual would literally cause the owners of the other funeral homes, whose businesses she wrote down on the dolls and jammed inside of Willie's body, that this ritual would literally cause all of them to be struck down and killed, putting their businesses out of business, thereby leading to her business prospering once again. However, none of these things came to fruition. The ritual did not work the way Paula intended it to. Instead, the hand that she had thrown into the river ultimately washed ashore, and before long, the police figured out what Paula and her son had done. In 1999, so 2 years after Willie's hand had washed up on shore, Paula and her son were found guilty of desecrating Willie's corpse. Paula's son ultimately served 1 year in prison. As for Paula, her conviction was actually quickly overturned due to a technicality. It was discovered that during an interview with Paula, that police detectives told her that she could not be convicted if this ritual was part of a religious practice, that she was protected under the US Constitution. And so Paula, who confessed to doing this ritual, did so by saying it was part of her religion. She practiced voodoo.
I am a voodooist, and I've survived because I know how to survive. And that's a part of my religion.
And so in court, that confession was ruled inadmissible. And so she walked free. Here is a photo of the 12 voodoo dolls found inside of Willie's body, with the notes Paula wrote cursing her competition still attached.
Are you the type of person who has binged basically all of my YouTube videos, and every week you anxiously wait a new upload? If so, thank you, but also you're in luck. Because if you didn't know this, we actually have a separate podcast, the MrBallen's podcast, that has literally hundreds of stories that are not on YouTube that you can binge right now. That podcast is available on all podcast platforms. Again, it's just called the MrBallen's podcast. And on Mondays on that podcast, we upload exclusive new content that is not on YouTube to the podcast. So that's Mondays. And then on Thursday, we remaster the audio of your favorite videos on YouTube and put those on the podcast. But again, Mondays, those are brand new and exclusive to the podcast. But if you want to hear those exclusive episodes 1 month ahead of Apple and Spotify and all the other platforms, well, there's only one place you can do that, and that's on Amazon Music. So again, you can go to any podcast platform and find the MrBallen's podcast, or if you're like me and you hate waiting, then you can listen early and ad-free on Amazon Music. I would imagine after you hear the ending to today's story that you will most likely go back and watch this all over again, because the ending completely changes the story. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all of the lids of their Tupperware with off-market brands so none of them fit. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. Ever since he was a child, Mark Twitchell had always dreamed of becoming a big-time Hollywood filmmaker. But he knew the odds were stacked against him because he lived in Edmonton, Canada, which was not exactly known for being a movie-making hub. Nonetheless, after high school, he enrolled in an Edmonton art college, and in 2000, he graduated, earning his degree in radio and television art. But after college, despite utilizing his training to make several films, none of them generated any buzz beyond his friends and family, and so it seemed like his filmmaking career was turning into a bit of a dud. However, in 2007, Mark had a bit of an unintentional breakthrough. He had been a longtime Star Wars fanatic, and that year, he decided, purely as a passion project, he was going to write a script for a prequel to the Star Wars franchise. When he finished it and shared the script with some of his colleagues, they were so impressed with his writing, they said, "Mark, you need to produce this into a movie. This is incredible." And so Mark, who was totally amazed at this unbelievable feedback he was getting, decided, you know what the heck, I will produce this movie. And so he began sending his script out to different actors and actresses to see if they might be interested in playing a role. And amazingly, one of the original Star Wars actors, Jeremy Bulloch, who played Boba Fett, he read the script and he was so impressed by it that he agreed to play a role in Mark's film. And so this passion project had quickly turned into Mark's biggest success yet. When the movie was finished, it did well, but it didn't propel Mark into Hollywood stardom. However, it did put him on the map as a bona fide filmmaker, and it showed him that if he just focused on making films about subjects he was already very passionate about, those films would be much more likely to succeed. And so in 2008, so roughly a year after creating the Star Wars fan fiction film, Mark decided to embark on another film project around another passion of his, Dexter. Dexter was a very popular TV show about a fictional serial killer whose name was Dexter, and the way Dexter would kill his victims is he would lure them into these small rooms, which he called kill rooms, and inside of them, basically every surface, the ceiling, the walls, the floor, were all covered in plastic sheeting to catch any of the blood, and then he would kill his victims, usually with a knife, and then afterwards he would dismember them and bag up their body, and he would roll up all this plastic, kind of collecting all the evidence, and then he would dump the plastic and the body into the ocean. Mark was obsessed with the show, and so it inspired him to make his next movie be about a killer too. Except instead of it being fiction like Dexter, he wanted his movie to be at least based on real events. And it just so happened, at the time he was thinking about doing this movie, there was this uncaught murderer terrorizing Edmonton, and so Mark decided the Edmonton killer would be his star. Mark would spend the next several weeks obsessively researching the Edmonton killer and his victims and establishing a clear timeline of what had happened with this case. And then after he felt like he had compiled every piece of information he possibly could, he used that research to concoct a 42-page first draft of his script. And as soon as he was done with that first draft, it somehow got leaked. And when it got leaked, the contents of this script were so shocking and so controversial that the script wound up in the hands of the Edmonton police. And when they read the script, they immediately recognized they had a big problem. They reached out to Mark and they told him under no circumstances can you turn this script into a movie, and then the police basically wiped this script off the face of the earth. Today, if you go looking for Mark's script online, you'll basically only find heavily censored versions of it. But recently, I got my hands on an uncensored version of this 42-page script. Now, I'm not going to literally read you this script. However, what I'm going to do is use the script's information to tell you Mark's highly controversial Edmonton killer story. As you listen, remember this story is based on actual events, and so the victims' names and the information about them is real. Okay, here we go. In early October 2008, a soft-spoken 26-year-old casino security guard named Giles Tetreault was living alone in Edmonton. Giles's life had recently been turned upside down because a few months earlier, his wife had told him that she just didn't love him anymore and that she was going to leave him. Giles was still very much in love with his wife, and so this was a totally heartbreaking experience for him. After she left, Giles tried to stay busy and keep his mind occupied, but it rarely worked. Oftentimes, he felt crushingly lonely and sad. But on Friday, October 3rd, when Giles came home from work that afternoon, he suddenly felt like, you know what, I gotta get my life together, and I'm gonna start by finding myself a new romantic partner. And so he went on a dating site and he made himself a profile, and he began scrolling through all of the women's profiles that lived roughly in his area. And at first, no one really appealed to him, but then he stopped on this one woman's profile. She was this young, blonde, beautiful woman named Sheena, and she lived right in Edmonton. And so Giles thought, what the heck, I'll send her a message. And so he did, just introducing himself and asking to talk further. And she responded just a couple of minutes later. And then over the next couple of hours, the two exchanged dozens of messages, getting to know each other. And then finally, Sheena just says to Giles, hey, you know, we live so close together. Why don't we get together tonight and go grab dinner and watch a movie together? And Giles is thrilled and he says, yeah, I'll come pick you up. What's your address? And Sheena would tell him, you know what, I don't feel comfortable sharing my address over this dating website. And so instead, she sent Giles this strange customized set of directions that didn't give the actual address of her house. Instead, it basically gave Giles a set of known landmarks in Edmonton that he could follow until he finally arrived at her residence. And she also told him that when he arrived, instead of just coming up to her house, there would be a detached garage and the door would be open and he would go through the garage, out the door into her backyard, and then he would go up the back steps to the back door of her house, and she would meet him there. Now, Giles did think this was a little bit strange, but at the same time, he's thinking, you know, I am basically a complete stranger to her. We just met today on the internet, and so I really can't blame her for taking some extra safety precautions with me. And so he told Sheena he had no issues using her special directions, and then he said he'd be over soon. And so Giles hopped in the shower, he freshened up, he got dressed, he hopped in his truck, and then he began driving to Sheena's house. After about 15 minutes of following these directions, he reached the end of them, and they placed him in this alleyway in a suburban neighborhood. And where he stopped, he looked off to his right, and he saw there was this 2-car garage, and he knew it was Sheena's garage because one of the doors was open like she said it would be, although the door was not open all the way. It was open enough to where he would have to duck to get into the garage, but either way, he knew it was her garage. And so he turns off his truck, and he gets out, and he tries to look up at Sheena's house behind the garage to see if maybe he can see her looking out the back door, but the detached garage that was right up against the street was kind of blocking his view, and so he thought, okay, whatever, I'll just go in and make my way up to the back steps. And so he walks over to this 2-car garage, and he goes to the open side, he ducks down, and he goes underneath, and he stands up inside of the garage. Now, it was dark inside of the garage, there was no light on, but there was enough light spilling in from the opening of the garage door that he could see there was really nothing in the garage. However, virtually every surface, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, was covered in plastic sheeting. Now, he had no idea what this plastic sheeting was for, and he really didn't care. He just kept walking across the garage towards the door that would lead into Sheena's backyard. And when he reached that door, he reached down to the door handle and he was about to turn it when he felt a blinding pain in the back of his neck. He whipped around, and even though it was dark inside of this garage, he could clearly see this huge man in a black and gold hockey mask standing right in front of him holding a stun baton. Giles tries to run past him to try to get out of the garage, but the man grabs him and then takes his stun baton and drives it into Giles' stomach, and he pulls the trigger. And immediately Giles feels this coursing pain in his torso, and he falls to the ground, and then this man in the mask releases the trigger, and Giles tries to scramble up to his feet to try to run out of the garage. But as soon as Giles turns around, he stops where he is because he sees this huge guy in the mask is standing between him and this open garage door, and he's now holding a gun in his hand and he's aiming it right at Giles. And so Giles freezes. He has no idea what's going on, and this man who's got this mask on barks at Giles to get on the ground and put your face on the ground. And so Giles at this point is thinking, I'm going to get killed in here. I have nothing I can do. I'm completely defenseless here. And so he just does what he's told, and he lies down on the plastic sheeting and he's totally terrified. And this man walks over and he puts a piece of duct tape over Giles's eyes. And so as he's laying there blind and terrified, Giles becomes very emotional. He suddenly longs for his ex-wife and for his family and his friends. He wishes he could see them just one more time, and he knows he's not going to. Then, as he's laying there, he's coming to the stark realization that he didn't tell anyone where he was going. And so if this masked maniac does kill him, who's going to find his body? Will his family and friends ever know what happened to him? So as he's laying there thinking of these horrible thoughts, he hears his attacker, who's several feet behind him, start fiddling with what sounds like chains or handcuffs. And Giles thinks to himself, if I get chained up in here, I really am done. And so he has this sudden surge of adrenaline where he thinks to himself, I'm going to get killed in here. I know it. I'm going to get killed. But if I'm going to die, I'm going to die on my terms. And so Giles takes a deep breath and then jumps to his feet, rips the tape off of his eyes. He turns around and he faces his attacker and he says, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to go out this way. And the attacker is totally surprised, but he just begins to raise his gun at Giles to shoot him. And Giles lunges forward and he grabs the barrel of the gun and he pushes it away from him. And as soon as he does that, Giles realizes something. The gun is made of plastic. It's fake. And so Giles is suddenly so confident, he grabs the arms of his attacker and he tries to kick the guy in the legs, but the attacker is so much bigger and stronger than Giles that he just headbutts Giles. Giles goes flying to the ground and his attacker jumps on top of him and begins punching him and slamming his skull into the ground. But Giles is so high on adrenaline, he can't feel any of the blows. All he's trying to do this whole time as he's getting pummeled is just find a way to stand up and run out of this garage. Just get out, escape. And amazingly, against all odds, he does manage in between blows to wriggle his way out of the attacker's grasp. But as he begins to run towards that opening in the garage door, the attacker grabs him by the jacket. And so Giles twists himself and he actually comes out of the jacket. And then he throws himself onto the ground and he rolls out of the garage. And as soon as he is free, he suddenly can't stand up. The stun baton, he didn't feel it before, but it had sapped all of his strength. But the adrenaline had kind of overridden that feeling. But here he is outside and he suddenly can't stand up. And so he's trying to stand up, and then the attacker, who's still inside, dives down, reaches out from underneath the garage and grabs Giles by the ankle and begins trying to pull him back into the garage. And so Giles is kicking and screaming and punching, and he finally breaks free. And then he has another surge of adrenaline and he stands up and just begins running down the alleyway. Doesn't even go to his car. He just starts running towards, hopefully, civilization. And he makes it a couple of houses before he collapses to the ground in this very busy walking trail. And so he's landed right in this intersection where he's hoping someone's going to be. He turns back and looks down the alleyway and he sees his attacker, who's now on the road. He's got the mask still on his face and he's charging up the road. Giles can't even get up. He's so tired, but Giles looks to his side and he sees there's this random couple walking down the walking path. They see Giles on the ground who's calling out for help, and they run over to him and they get right in front of Giles, and Giles immediately points at the attacker coming down the alleyway and says, he's trying to kill me. And the attacker amazingly just jogs right up to Giles, right up to the couple. He does not take his mask off and he acts like he's friends with Giles and says, oh, come on, Frank, you're making a big deal out of it. It's a game. Come back to the garage. I'll meet you there. And then the attacker just turns around and walks back down the alleyway back towards his garage. And so Giles turns and looks up at the couple, who are totally freaked out by this whole situation. They don't know if this is some weird setup that they're going to get robbed or something. They don't know if this is a hoax. And so they say, hey, you're on your own, pal. And they turn and they leave. And so Giles is left in the middle of this intersection. The only people that could have helped him are now gone. And so he rolls over and just looks down the alleyway in the direction of the garage. And he can actually see his attacker pacing back and forth inside of the garage because that door is partially open. And so Giles doesn't know what to do. He has to get to his truck to get out of here. And so he just sits there for a couple of seconds, just watching the attacker, making sure he's staying inside of the garage. And then finally, he just took a deep breath. He pulled himself up and he stumbled down the alleyway. He got in his truck, fired it up, and he peeled out of there. When Giles got home, he was obviously traumatized from this horrible thing that had just happened to him, but he also felt embarrassed and kind of ashamed that he had clearly just gotten catfished by the psycho in the garage. Obviously, Sheena, the woman he supposedly was talking to, was not real. It was that guy in the garage that had attacked him, but he didn't really understand why it had happened. He had no idea why anyone would target him, and so the whole situation was just such a mess. He decided, you know what, I'm not going to tell anyone. He didn't report it to the police. He didn't tell his friends. He didn't tell his family. He just decided he was going to move on and forget about it. A week later, on October 8th, another Edmonton man, 38-year-old Johnny Altinger, was perusing the dating website that Giles had been using. Johnny made a living doing quality control control for an oil and gas company, but he hated that job. He much preferred to spend his time tinkering with his computers or his prized motorcycle. Johnny had lots of very close friends, but romance was always something that had eluded him. So that afternoon, Johnny, like Giles, was on this dating website to potentially find a romantic partner. And so as he was scrolling through all of these different women's profiles that lived roughly in his area, he wasn't interested in any of them until he stopped on this one profile of this beautiful young blonde woman named Jen, who lived right in Edmonton. And so Johnny was interested. He sent her a message, and very quickly she wrote back, and before long the two are chumming it up, and then eventually they actually agree to get together that night for dinner and a movie. But when Johnny asked Jen for her address, she would tell him that she's a paranoid person and she doesn't want to give him her actual address over this website, and so instead she gave him a set of very strange directions that relied on local landmarks in Edmonton to guide him into her residence. And she would tell Johnny, when you get here, go through the garage, the door will be open, go out the back door, go into the backyard, make your way up to the back of the house, and I will meet you at the back door. And so Johnny definitely thought these directions were very strange, but he was really eager to meet up with Jen, and so he really didn't care. And so he told Jen it was no big deal, he'd happily follow her directions, and then he hopped in the shower and he got himself together, and then before he left to go to Jen's house, he forwarded Jen's email that included her very strange directions. He sent those directions to one of his very close friends, and he kind of jokingly included a message that was like, hey, if I go missing tonight, this is where I'm going. And then Johnny hopped in his car and he left. The directions brought Johnny to the same garage in the same alleyway that Giles had been to a week earlier. And when Johnny came to a stop in front of Jen's 2-car garage with one of the doors partially open, he saw there were lights still on inside of the garage, and he saw someone walking around inside. And so Johnny looked at his watch and he realized he was maybe 15 or 20 minutes too early, and so he parks his car and he's thinking, okay, Jen might be inside of this garage and I'm early, but maybe I'll just walk over and say hi to her. I'm sure she wouldn't mind. And so Johnny turns off his car, he gets out, and he starts walking over to this half-open garage door, and as he gets closer and closer, the lights in the garage go off. And so Johnny stops and he's thinking, why are the lights off? Did she hear me? Does she not want me to come in? What's going on? But he's thinking, okay, well, I should definitely go over and say something. And so he walks over to this open garage door and he bends down and he looks inside and it's totally dark. And he just says, hello? And there's a pause, and then the lights come on, and Johnny suddenly sees this garage that's basically devoid of anything, minus a table off to the side, and every surface is covered in plastic sheeting. The floors, the walls, the ceiling, everything. And in the back of the garage is not Jen. Instead, it's this man he doesn't recognize. And so Johnny's looking at this man, and this man is looking over at Johnny, and finally the man speaks and says, hi, I'm Harry. I'm a designer. I rent this garage out from Jen. And I just talked to Jen, and you're meeting up with her tonight, right? You're meeting up with Jen? Yeah. She's running late. So I think she'll be back in about maybe 20 minutes. So can you come back in 20 minutes, come right back here, come to the garage, and I'll bring you up to the house, because I know you're meeting her up at the house. So 20 minutes. And so Johnny doesn't really know what to make of this. He figures, okay, I don't really know what Jen's arrangement is with this designer in this plastic covered garage, but whatever. And so Johnny says, okay, no problem. I'll come back in 20 minutes. And so Johnny turns around and he walks back to his car and he leaves and drives around for about 20 minutes. And then he comes back to the garage. And as soon as he parks, he notices right away the light in the garage is now off. So presumably Harry has actually left. And so he will not be available to walk Johnny up to the house to meet Jen. But Johnny was thinking, I don't really want to interact with Harry. He seems like a strange guy anyways. And so he counts this as a win. And so Johnny parks his car, he hops out, he walks over to the garage, he bends down and goes inside of the garage. He stands up and he walks across the plastic lined floor to the door that's going to lead out into Jen's backyard. But before he reaches that door, something smashes into the back of his head. And immediately Johnny is horribly dazed and he instinctively throws his hands up to protect his head, and he begins spinning around trying to figure out who or what had just hit him. And as soon as he turns around, he sees in the shadows is the figure of none other than the man he saw before, Harry. And Harry is holding a big metal pipe. And immediately when Johnny sees him, he begins screaming, police, police, police. And Harry just winds up and wails on Johnny with this metal pipe. And Johnny's trying to turn around and get away from Harry, but Harry just keeps moving around him and beating him him with this pipe until finally Johnny collapses on the ground, but he's not unconscious. And so Johnny is kind of shielding his head and he's looking up at Harry, who's now just standing over him. He's ceased his initial barrage. And Johnny begins pleading with Harry, I'll give you money, I'll give you anything, just please let me go. And so Harry smiles and he says, you promise you won't tell anyone if I let you go? But before Johnny could answer this, Harry winds up with his pipe and he brings it crashing down on Johnny's face. But amazingly, this does not knock Johnny unconscious. Instead, Johnny grabs the pipe after it hits him in the head and he holds onto it to prevent Harry from hitting him again. And so at this point, Harry is frustrated that Johnny is still putting up this huge fight. And so with one hand holding onto this pipe that Johnny has the other end of, Harry reaches down with his other hand and he unsheaths a hunting knife. And he holds the blade right in front of Johnny's face. And as soon as Johnny sees this knife, his eyes go wide and he lets go of the pipe and he begins to plead for his life. But Harry just smiles and continues to show him the blade. And then at some point he grabs Johnny's shoulder, he pulls the knife back and he plunges it into Johnny's stomach. Johnny howls out in pain and he curls over and he begins screaming for the police, screaming for someone to help him. And then finally Harry pulls the knife out of his stomach and then plunges it into the side of Johnny's neck. And then Harry lets go of the knife and he stands up and he just watches Johnny as he bleeds out onto the plastic lining. As Harry watched Johnny die, he had this pang of regret. He thought to himself, why didn't I play more mind games with him before I killed him? I'll do that with the next one. After Johnny died, Harry would dismember and bag up Johnny's body, and then he would roll up all of the plastic from the walls and the ceiling. He'd gather that all up, and then a couple of days later, he would dump both Johnny's body parts and all of the plastic containing all of the evidence down a nearby sewer drain. At this point in the story, Mark's script just kind of comes to an abrupt end. We don't know what Harry did after getting rid of Johnny's body and the evidence because Mark just didn't write it. It was like he didn't finish the script. And there's a reason for that, and it's the same reason the police stepped in and stopped Mark from making this script into a movie. At the time they read his script, the police had already figured out who owned the garage where Giles and Johnny were attacked. Johnny's friend, the one who Johnny had forwarded Jen's email that had those strange directions, well, that friend gave those directions to the police once Johnny had been reported missing. And so the police followed these strange directions to this garage, and they discovered it was not owned by some young, beautiful blonde named Jen or Sheena. It was not owned by some designer named Harry. It was owned by a young, up-and-coming filmmaker named Mark Twitchell. But to this point, Mark had been extremely cooperative with police and allowed them to search it, and they found nothing. And he explained to them he was not remotely the only person with access to this garage, not by a long shot. But when police searched Mark's laptop, they found a hidden document, and this document was his 42-page script. And when they read it, they saw there was a huge issue. Giles, the first victim of the Edmonton killer, had eventually gotten over his embarrassment and shame, and he went to the Edmonton police and he told them in detail what happened to him inside of that garage. But Giles was so scared he had not told anybody else what had happened. The only people who knew were himself and the Edmonton police. Yet somehow, in Mark's script, the account of what happened to Giles was exactly correct. Every little detail of what happened to Giles was encompassed inside of this script. And the reason Mark had this information is because Mark was in the garage when Giles got attacked. Because Mark was the Edmonton killer. Mark had been so desperate to make his killer in his new movie as good as Dexter in the TV show that Mark decided he needed to literally become Dexter in real life. He needed to know exactly what it felt like to lure an unsuspecting victim into a kill room and murder them so that he'd be able to more accurately write about it in his script. He believed this would put his movie over the top. It would be the most authentic killer movie ever, and it would be his ticket to Hollywood. And so after Mark used a fake dating profile to trap and then attack Giles, after that experience, he wrote about it, and that became his script. And then when he did the same thing to Johnny and then actually successfully killed and disposed of him, he sat down and wrote about that experience too and tacked it onto the end of the Giles attack. He was literally living his movie and writing the script in real time. time. The title that Mark gave his script was SK Confessions, which stood for Serial Killer Confessions. And that's exactly what the script was. It was a real confession. And based on the way his script just kind of abruptly ends without any sort of conclusion, it seems fairly obvious that Mark was planning to kill more people and then incorporate those experiences into this script. Ultimately, though, the script that was found by police was used to convict Mark of murder, and he is currently serving life in prison. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the Like Button's house and replace all of the lids of their Tupperware with off-market brands so none of them fit. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballin.com. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just Mr. Ballin. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is also Mr. Ballin. We also have a second YouTube channel just called Mr. Ballin Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called Mr. Ballin where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
On May 22nd, 1993, a man named Kurt was carrying some boxes into his new home. He had just moved into this 2-story house along with his fiancée, whose name was Kim. Kurt went into the house and he dropped the boxes in the foyer, and then he turned back to head back down to the car to get another load. And as he walked down the steps, he passed his fiancée, Kim, and they smiled at each other. She was making her way up, he was making his way down. But seconds after they passed each other, right as Kurt got back to the car, he felt this incredible pressure and blast wave hit him in the back that almost sent him flying. And then when Kurt turned around, he could not believe what he saw. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and replace their toothpaste with numbing cream. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of Friday, May 21st, 1993, a 29-year-old woman named Kim Wenger clapped her hands together in front of her with happiness in the basement of the Golden Congregational Church in rural Iowa. Her closest friends had gathered here to throw Kim and her fiancé, 32-year-old Kurt Simon, a combination wedding shower and goodbye party, and now they were presenting the couple with their gift. It was a money tree, planted in a little yellow coffee can with envelopes full of cash hanging off of it. Kim and Kurt both smiled and began making their way through the crowd to give everybody a big hug and to say thank you. Tonight was a big night for them. All their plans were finally falling into place. Tomorrow, they would pack all of Kurt's belongings into their car, and they would drive 230 miles south from the place where he had been living in Iowa to the city of Bloomington, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, where Kim already lived. And in Bloomington, they would begin their new life together as a soon-to-be married couple, raising Kim's 2 children from previous relationships. It had been a whirlwind 8 months since they had first met on actually a blind date. Kim had known almost immediately that Kurt really was something special, but it hadn't been easy for them to get to this point. They both had almost no money. Kurt was studying to be a Presbyterian minister and living in Iowa to finish seminary school. And Kim was a single mom living in Bloomington who had just recently quit her office job because her coworker was sexually harassing her. She'd taken on off-the-books work as a hairdresser and house cleaner, but she still had to rely on public assistance to make ends meet. The long-distance relationship itself was also just exhausting, with all the driving back and forth. And it didn't help that Kim had contentious relationships with the fathers of both of her kids. Her 1-year-old son's father, Dale Fosdick, was always late with his child support payments, and he still acted like he was entitled to walk right into Kim's house anytime he wanted.
Kurt had actually recently confronted him about doing that and told him to stop, which Dale did not seem to appreciate. Her 7-year-old daughter's father, Todd Wenger, really wasn't much better. Todd fought with Kem all the time over their custody arrangement, and he and her other ex, Dale, were actually friends, which really annoyed Kem. But now, as somebody handed Kem a piece of cake in the church basement, all those problems seemed like they were about to get a whole lot smaller. Kurt was moving in, and Kem was about to get her whole life organized. Waiting for her at home in Bloomington, she had a whole collection of modern bride magazines so she could plan their wedding, and she and Kurt were actually talking about Kurt maybe adopting her son. And she knew Kurt could very quickly get a job in Bloomington as a pastoral counselor, and they could maybe save some money by only having to pay for one residence now. And this money tree they were getting was a sweet start. I mean, Kem knew that the members of the congregation were not wealthy people by any stretch. But, she found it very touching that they'd pooled their limited resources to give her and Kurt such a wonderful send-off. The only thing that could make this moment any better would be if Kem's mother, Cricket, was there. But unfortunately, Kem and Cricket were estranged. Kem wished she could be closer to her mother, but Cricket had a mean streak, and for some reason, she really hated Kurt. Kem finished her cake and then checked the time, and she realized, it was time to go, so she tapped Kurt on the shoulder as he was speaking to some friends. They had a lot left to pack tomorrow morning, and they had a long drive ahead of them. So Kem and Kurt made their goodbyes and then headed out of the church holding hands. The next day was Saturday, May 22nd, and Kem and Kurt spent the first part of the day packing and then the second part driving. And then finally, at 10:30 p.m. that night, they pulled their car into the driveway of Kem's 2-story house in Bloomington, the home they would now share together. Kem just sat for a second in the passenger seat while Kurt got out of the car and opened up the trunk. They had a lot of stuff to carry in, but Kem was just exhausted and frankly didn't feel like doing it quite yet. So she watched as Kurt went ahead and walked up the front stairs carrying a box and the money tree. He unlocked the door, he stepped inside, and then a minute later, he came back out empty-handed. And at that point, Kem sighed and decided she better get out and help too. Kurt was halfway back down the stairs as Kem grabbed her own box out of the trunk and walked her way into the house, into the foyer of her home. She put her box down and was about to go back outside and do another trip with Kurt when she paused. There was something she didn't recognize on the floor of the foyer that had not been there when she had left for Iowa. Kurt was outside, facing away from the house, when an intense wave of pressure hit him from behind. And nearly at the exact same time, this booming sound like some kind of explosion filled his ears. He stumbled forward almost uncontrollably and then whipped around and called out for Kem. But his ears were ringing now and he couldn't really tell if she had answered. There was smoke pouring out from the front door of their house, and instinctively he just ran into the house, into the foyer to go find Kem. When he got in there, there's all this smoke and chaos, there's shards of broken glass everywhere, and also he noticed all these little pieces of what looked like metal kind of all over the foyer. Kurt screamed Kem's name over and over, and he looked frantically all around through all the rubble, but it was impossible to see. It was like everything was destroyed in here. And so now, beginning to gasp from all the smoke, he started walking around the foyer, kind of ducking below the smoke as best as he could, and that's when he saw legs on the floor. Minutes later, Detective Larry Shepard of the Bloomington Police Department pulled up outside the 2-story house in his cruiser, with his partner beside him and another squad car behind them. Shepard did not usually respond to 911 calls because he was a homicide detective, but he had happened to be in the area when dispatch requested officers go check out a report of potentially a shotgun blast on a residential street. However, the second he stepped out of his car and looked at this 2-story house, Shepard knew this could not have been a shotgun blast. There was all this black smoke billowing out the front door of the house, and although Shepard couldn't see any fire, he could hear the fire alarm going off inside. And outside, the street was chaos. There were all these people who Shepard guessed must be neighbors shouting and running around, and there was debris everywhere. Broken glass and splintered pieces of wood and chunks of metal that had basically been blown out of the house out onto the street. In the driveway of this home, Shepard could see there was a man who had his hands on his head and he looked frantic, and he was yelling the name Kem over and over again as he looked towards the destroyed house. And it was at that point Shepard realized there must be someone or multiple people inside of the house. And he really couldn't wait for backup to go find them. So he and his partner shouted for everyone to stay back, and then they raced up the stairs into the smoke. Once Shepard was inside the front foyer, he could tell there was no active fire, just lots of smoke kind of hanging in the air, and he looked around and he saw there was a 6-inch hole on the wall right near the front door, and there was another hole right in the floor of the foyer. But even though he saw those things pretty quickly, his attention quickly snapped to the body of a woman who was on the ground, and it was immediately clear that there was nothing they could do for her. Literally half of her head was just missing. In his entire career, Shepard had never worked a murder case where the weapon was a bomb. But standing in this blackened, destroyed foyer over the charred body of this woman, Shepard felt sure that that is exactly what he was looking at right now. Around this point, the officers from the other squad car had now come up the stairs and into the house. But Shepard told them to get back, go back outside, because the scene was not safe to process yet. They needed the fire department here, and they needed the bomb squad, because there could be more explosives. Not long afterwards, Shepard and the other officers stood on the front lawn as members of the fire department and the state police bomb squad combed through the scene. By this point, Detective Shepard had learned a bit more about what had happened. The dead woman was Kem Wenger, and the man he had seen screaming in the driveway was Kem's fiancé, Kurt Simon. Neighbors said the pair had arrived around 10:30 p.m., and a couple of the neighbors had actually noticed them before the blast went off when they started unloading their car. These neighbors said that they saw Kurt be the first one to go inside the house, and when he did, he went in carrying a box that he had pulled from the back of the car. And then these neighbors said they saw Kurt come out again, empty-handed, but he went down to the back of the car again, and he appeared to put something in the trunk. And at the same time, Kem had grabbed a box from the car, and she went into the house by herself, and that's when the explosion happened. Shepard was troubled by these accounts. He thought it was suspicious that Kurt had been able to walk into the house without getting hurt, and then just seconds later, Kem goes in and her arrival seems to have triggered the explosion. And so naturally, he wondered if maybe that box Kurt was carrying that he went inside with, maybe that was the bomb, and he planted it. And then when he left, she goes in and it obviously goes off. And then also he wondered, what had Kurt put back into his car after he came out again? What did he put into the trunk? But even more suspicious than any of that was what a preliminary sweep of Kem's home had turned up in the basement. And that was wires, gunpowder, and fuses. Shepard did not need to be a bomb expert to know that these could be components of a bomb, and that whoever killed Kem must have built the bomb right there in her basement, which naturally made Kurt Simon the number one suspect. So Shepard told a crime scene tech to process Kurt's vehicle and pay extra attention to the trunk. Then the detective walked over to Kurt himself. And Kurt was rocking back and forth, and he was crying, and he was still just saying Kem over and over and over again. Shepard asked Kurt if he could tell him, what had happened here. And Kurt looked at him with this vacant and shocked expression, and he told the detective that he didn't know what happened. He'd gone inside with a box, and he had just started back down the stairs when he felt the blast behind him. And at this, Shepard's eyes narrowed, because according to the neighbor's account, they said Kurt was actually at his trunk, putting something back into the car at the time of the explosion. But Kurt was now claiming that he had actually only just exited the house, basically was on the stairs as the blast happened. Now, this discrepancy could just be a result of confusion, or Kurt could be lying to cover up whatever he may or may not have done. But independent of whatever this was, Shepard just told Kurt that right now he was going down to the station for questioning. Several hours later, a little before dawn on Sunday, May 23, 1993, Detective Shepard walked out of the interrogation room in the Bloomington, Illinois police station, where he'd just spent more than an hour hammering Kurt Simon with questions about his murdered fiancée. And Kurt had been a pretty difficult interview. He had plenty of ideas about other people who might have killed Kem. He told Shepard that both the fathers of Kem's children, Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, fought with her all the time. And he said that Kem's estranged mom, Wilma Lewis, who everybody called Cricket, was, quote, every kind of evil. But Kurt had seemed to have no information to offer about what he had actually witnessed before the explosion. He had stuck to a story that he had not seen anything suspicious at all in the foyer, which Shepard found hard to believe. Kurt also had no explanation for why the bomb exploded on Kem and not on him, and he also denied knowing anything about the bomb-making materials that had been found in Kem's basement. Kurt also said he hadn't put anything back in his trunk around the time of the explosion, but he couldn't explain why the neighbors said he had. Shepard ultimately thought Kurt was either the most unobservant person alive, or he was lying. And on top of all that, Kurt had refused to take a lie detector test. However, Shepard still had to let him go home. The detective just didn't have anywhere near enough evidence to arrest Kurt, at least not yet. At this point, the bomb squad was actually still searching the house for any additional bombs, so the crime scene techs had not gotten in yet to begin to start looking for forensic evidence. They actually hadn't even been able to remove Kem's body yet. Shepard knew the day ahead was going to be very busy. Other members of his team had spent the entire night canvassing the neighborhood and notifying and questioning Kem's family members, and now Shepard was sure there was going to be quite a few interrogations for him to conduct. He'd already been awake for 24 hours by this point, but he knew there was not going to be any sleep soon. So he walked to the office coffee pot and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood there drinking it and thinking about how he was going to nail Kurt Simon for murder. Meanwhile, the bombing itself was making huge news all across Illinois. By about 9 a.m. on Sunday morning, so less than 12 hours after the explosion, there were all these reporters milling around the front entrance of the police station, and some were even going in and out of the lobby trying to talk to people and get any information. And Detective Shepard knew this story was only going to get bigger, because the Illinois State Bomb Squad had just called in the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF, to help them process the scene. And all that meant there was going to be an enormous amount of pressure on Shepard, who was leading the investigation. And this pressure was especially stressful this morning because the case he'd thought he'd had against Kem's fiance, Kurt Simon, was starting to fall apart. In all their interviews with Kem's friends, everyone had said Kem and Kurt had a good relationship and were excited to start their life together. The crime scene unit had searched Kurt's car, where neighbors claimed they had seen him place something in the trunk right after the explosion or manipulate something back there, maybe a detonator. But the crime scene techs had found nothing suspicious at all back there. Shepard's partner had checked out Kurt's story that he had spent the entire week previous to the explosion in Iowa, where he lived, and he was moving here to Bloomington to live with Kem. And they had found out that that story was true. He really had been in Iowa. And so this made Shepard's theory that Kurt had assembled the bomb in Kem's basement a lot less likely, since Kem was home all week and Kurt wasn't there. Plus, Kem's babysitter had given police 2 additional pieces of information that really widened the suspect pool. First, she said that the spare key to Kem's house had recently gone missing. And the second thing was, because the spare key was gone, Kem had gotten locked out at some point and had to cut a hole in the screen in the back door to get inside. And so this meant that basically anybody could have gotten inside of Kem's house to build the bomb if they just went in through the back door. Or if they, had the key, if they stole the key. So Shepard's suspect list effectively had gone from Kurt to all of Bloomington. Just before lunchtime, Shepard walked into the station's interrogation room where Kem's ex-husband, Todd Wenger, was sitting waiting for him. With Kem's fiancé, Kurt, looking less and less likely as a suspect, the detectives had set their sight on Kem's exes. Both Todd, who was the father of Kem's daughter, and Dale Fosdick, who was the father of Kem's son, not only had obvious motives, but they also knew Kem's schedule, because each of them had been watching one of her children over the weekend before she was killed. Shepard's partner had actually already spoken to Dale. Basically a couple of hours after the explosion, he had spoken to him, while Shepard himself had been busy questioning Kurt. And during that exchange, Dale had seemed shocked by Kem's death, and he'd made what seemed like a good faith effort to answer the detective's questions, although his son kept crying and interrupting them. Dale did admit to having some tension with Kem, but he also had an alibi. He'd been with family in the morning and doing yard work in full view of his neighbors in the afternoon and the evening. He'd given Shepard's partner names and phone numbers of potential witnesses that could have witnessed this, and a preliminary round of calls to those witnesses had suggested that Dale was telling the truth. But the detectives were conducting all their interviews with very little information about the crime itself, because they didn't really know how the bomb that killed Kem actually worked. They weren't sure if the killer had to be, right nearby to detonate it, or if maybe it had been remote operated so the killer could be farther away, or maybe the bomb was just set to some kind of timer. Scientists at the ATF were trying to reconstruct the bomb from all the shrapnel, but until they did that, Shepard and his partner would not know exactly when the killer would have been at Kem's house. And none of the neighbors had reported seeing anything unusual around the time of the explosion that would help them narrow it down. So now, as Detective Shepard sat down across the interrogation table from Kem's ex-husband Todd Wenger, he started with some general questions about his relationship with Kem. And Todd seemed a little nervous because he kept wringing his hands while he spoke. He said that he and Kem did fight about child support costs, and he said he had been very frustrated with her because he didn't feel like she was always fair during their divorce. But he insisted that that did not mean he wanted to hurt her. He said their problems were common for most divorced couples. Shepard did not put much stock in that assertion because in his experience, divorce or breakup plus money was a very good motive to hurt somebody. So he asked Todd where he'd been all day on the night of the blast. And at this question, Todd definitely appeared to relax, and he launched into a very detailed explanation of all his movements. He said he'd been with his daughter and his new girlfriend, and both of them would definitely vouch for him, along with several people who had seen them during the day. By the time Shepard sent Todd home, he really wasn't sure which of the exes, Todd or Dale, he thought was a better candidate for his killer. Both had clearly been fighting with Kem or had real tension with Kem, but both had alibi witnesses. So, Kem's fiancé Kurt might have had the opportunity to plant the bomb if it was set shortly before the explosion, but he had no clear motive. As for Todd and Dale, they seemed to have plenty of motive, but no real opportunity. And so Shepard decided his next move should be to talk again to Kem's family. Maybe they would be able to help him sort out his flawed suspect list. On Sunday evening, so almost 24 hours after the explosion, Detective Shepard knocked on the door of the home where Kem's sister, Joni, lived. Now, by this point, another officer had already been there to tell her and their mother, Cricket, about Kem's death, but Shepard wanted to hear from them himself. Now, Shepard had been told that Kem and her mother were estranged, but even though he went in with some idea that this interaction could be odd, Shepard was still really caught off guard by the way Cricket was acting. It was like way over the top. As Joni welcomed Shepard inside and offered him a seat on the couch, she was crying. Her reaction to the death of her sister seemed very genuine. But Cricket was not crying or showing any signs of being sad. Instead, she was just furious, and not about the murder or about losing her child or about the fact that police had not made an arrest yet. She was furious about her child's life insurance policy, which apparently Kem had not added her to as a beneficiary, which meant that Cricket was not going to be paid any money despite her child being killed. As Shepard seeing this, he thought about how Kurt had insisted in his interrogation that Cricket was a horrible person, that she was evil. Now, at the time, Shepard had not really taken that seriously because he figured Kurt was trying to throw suspicion off of himself, and lots of people don't like their mother-in-laws. But now he was reconsidering. He felt like he was witnessing someone who could be just as bad as they were described to be. And then, when Shepard actually asked Cricket about her relationship with her now deceased daughter, Cricket went off, but not about her relationship really with Kem, but more about Kurt and how Kurt had ruined Kem's life. She said Kurt was a terrible partner for Kem and that he had destroyed the best relationship she ever had, which Cricket said was with Dale Fosdick, the father of Kem's son. She also said that Kurt had destroyed her, Cricket's relationship with Kem too. She said that she and her daughter used to talk every day, but once Kurt was in the picture, she had been forbidden to call the house at all. Now, to Shepard, Cricket seemed completely scattered, bouncing from one subject to another and just mad about everything. But he started to wonder if what he was witnessing here was not just pure selfishness and being a terrible person, but instead could be some kind of very complicated grief, or maybe even guilt, or grief and guilt combined. But one thing was definitely true, which was Cricket really seemed to hate Kurt as much as Kurt seemed to hate her. And Shepard just wasn't sure which one of them was in the right. But it was around this point in the conversation that Kem's sister, Joni, cut in, and she offered up a potential suspect idea of her own. She said that Kem had recently left a job where a colleague, a man named Phil Hartman, had sexually harassed her. Following this, Kem had actually gotten a settlement out of it, and apparently Phil had made threats afterwards, including a promise to get her for this. And so Joni said it was Phil who the police really should be investigating for this murder. When Shepard finally left the house, his head was spinning. He'd gone to Cricket and Joni hoping for clarity, sorting out his 3 suspects. But he'd come away with less clarity and now 5 suspects. Kem's fiancé Kurt, her exes Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, her co-worker Phil Hartman, and frankly, Cricket herself. At this point, it was late on Sunday night, and Shepard had been awake since Saturday morning, and so he decided the best thing he could do now was just go home and get some sleep. That way, he could come back with a clear head on Monday morning and maybe make sense of it then. On the afternoon of Monday, May 24th, so almost 2 days after the bombing that killed Kem Wenger, Detective Larry Shepard walked through the front door of Kem's house, feeling cautiously optimistic. On the night the bomb went off, the police had to evacuate so the State Bomb Squad and the ATF could make sure there were no additional explosives. But finally, the night before, the scene had officially been cleared, which meant Shepard could now enter the house and actually look around for himself. Inside the house, he could see that the foyer was still in complete disarray, although Kem's body by this point had been removed and autopsied. There were also now all these little flags and markers all over the place, pointing out how she'd been positioned on the floor and where various bomb fragments and other evidence had been collected. And also now, because the feds had completed a preliminary assessment of the bomb, Shepard could actually imagine how the bombing went down. There was a 6-inch hole in the foyer floor, and Shepard now knew that that was where the bomb had been placed, right there on the ground, probably concealed in some kind of a small box or package. From the autopsy, which had shown distinct damage to Kem's right hand, Shepard knew that what likely happened was that she had spotted the package and picked it up with her right hand, which then triggered the explosion. And this was actually the single most important thing the feds had been able to determine, that the bomb was motion activated. This was huge, because it meant the bomber did not have to be at or even near Kem's house to trigger the explosion manually, which meant they could have left this thing there any time during the weekend. This also explained why there were a bunch of wires and bomb-making materials found in the basement, because if the bomb had been built somewhere else and transported to Kem's house in, say, a car, the bomb could have exploded along the way. So what likely happened was that Kem's killer brought a partially finished bomb to Kem's house that would not detonate as they carried it, and then they put the final touches on it right on site, once it was actually in position in the foyer. This also meant the bomber had to be pretty sophisticated, because building a bomb like this took technical skill, it took some intelligence and real attention to detail, because if you don't have those things, you can set off the bomb and kill yourself. And so, in Shepard's mind, this likely took Kem's mother, Cricket, right off the table. She just did not strike him as organized enough or really coherent enough to build this type of bomb. She just seemed way too scatterbrained. Kem's exes, Dale Fosdick and Todd Wenger, both worked with machines for a living, so they were definitely still in. And her fiancé Kurt was highly educated, so he was still in. Shepard wasn't sure about Phil Hartman, the co-worker who Kem had accused of sexually harassing her. He had reached Phil by phone that morning, and Phil had told him he was working in Louisiana at the time the bomb went off, hundreds of miles away. But Shepard knew just being physically far away from the bomb when it went off was not a perfect alibi, because it was motion activated. You could place it and then travel and be far away. But at the same time, Louisiana was really far away, and Phil really didn't seem to have any technical background that Shepard had found, so Phil was still in, but less so. As Shepard stood there in the blackened, destroyed foyer, looking at the partially burned pages of Modern Bride magazines that had been blown all over the room, he thought about the fact that whoever had done this had to have been very comfortable in Kem's house, They had gotten inside the house at some point, and then clearly spent time in the basement tinkering with the bomb. Then they came up and they're in the foyer setting the bomb up. I mean, that's someone who's pretty confident they're not going to get caught doing all this inside the house. That's serious boldness. And so Shepard was starting to feel pretty confident that whoever had done this was either family to Kem or as close to her as family. Shepard left Kem's house thinking about how he might search both Dale and Todd's places of work to see if any of the machinery they used shared parts with the bomb. But as he stepped off the final step onto the sidewalk, he heard a voice call out behind him, and he turned to see a Bloomington police officer jogging over towards him. The bombing had created real panic, not just in Bloomington, but across Illinois. People were now terrified that there was going to be a bomb that would show up on their front porch. They would see a package they didn't recognize, and they would call the police with fears that that could be an explosive. I mean, it was like this paranoia had swept the state. And so in response to that, specifically in Bloomington, the police had a much stronger presence out on the street. And Shepard had also asked officers to recanvass Kem's neighborhood, to question the neighbors again, now that they knew more about the bomb itself. Specifically, that the bomb was motion activated, which meant the bomber did not need to be there basically right before it went off. They were in the house. They were building the bomb days before. They planted the bomb in advance of the bombing, so there was a bigger window of time that they were wondering who was at Kem's house, who was acting suspicious near Kem's house in the days leading up to the bombing. Those were the questions they had for the neighbors. And so this officer that was running over to Shepard, that's what they had been doing, recanvassing the neighborhood. And when he reached Shepard, he told him he'd found something. Shepard eagerly followed the officer over to one of Kem's neighbors' houses, and there he saw a little girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, standing nervously next to her father. And based on what this little girl would say, along with evidence collected by the Bloomington Police Department and the ATF, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Kem Wenger on May 22, 1993. At around 10:30 that morning, the killer pulled up in their car outside of Kem's house. They picked up a bag that was sitting on their passenger seat, which contained a partially completed pipe bomb and some tools. With this in hand, they got out of the car and they walked up to the front door and they pulled a key from their pocket. This was the same key they had stolen from under the doormat a few months earlier. They used the key to unlock the front door and they let themselves inside. The killer then walked down to the basement, where they took all the various items from the bag and placed them on the counter, and they got to work. The killer was not worried about getting caught. They knew this neighborhood very well, and everybody in this neighborhood knew them, and they would not find it suspicious at all to see them there. Plus, they knew they would have an alibi for the time period when the bomb actually would go off. Once the bomb was mostly assembled, the killer gathered up most of their things. They left behind some random supplies in the basement, but figured it didn't really matter since the explosion would take care of everything. Feeling very confident in their workmanship so far, the killer walked back upstairs and placed the nearly completed bomb on the floor in the foyer. And then, as they completed the final steps, they could feel sweat beating on their forehead, because if they did anything wrong, the bomb would go off. But the killer got it all done, and they stood up very slowly and carefully and walked back out through the front door. But before they could get in their car and drive away, they saw one of the neighborhood girls playing in the yard next door. And the girl looked at them and waved and said hello. And the killer, who felt like they belonged there and no one will remember me, they waved back. Well, the little girl remembered that interaction, and she would tell Detective Shepard who she saw leaving Kem's house. It was none other than Kem's ex-boyfriend and the father of her son, Dale Fosdick. Dale was very upset that Kem had broken up with him and was now seeing Kurt. He had also heard from Cricket, who he was still very close with, that Kurt had talked about adopting his own son, and this enraged him. He couldn't stand the idea that his own boy might grow up calling another man dad. So he used the electronic skills and the tools he'd acquired from his hobby of building model airplanes to build a pipe bomb. And so ultimately, Dale was caught because of his entitlement to feel like he could just stroll into Kem's house anytime he wanted. Because he did that all the time, despite her saying not to, he became a familiar face in the neighborhood. And that's why that little girl remembered him. After months of forensic work that tied Dale even more closely to the bomb, he was finally arrested and found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 61 years in prison. But he would only serve 14 of those years because in 2010, while still behind bars, Dale died of a sudden illness. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today's top story is so wildly improbable that if there wasn't footage, nobody would believe it happened. Luckily, I've included the footage. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of these strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and steal all of their sweatpants strings. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1974, Jean-Claude Romand enrolled in medical school in Lyon, France. He was a model student who excelled despite the notoriously brutal course load. In 1980, he married his girlfriend, and shortly after that, they had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. In 1983, he officially became a doctor and landed a great job as a researcher at the World Health Organization in Geneva. His focus was on finding new medicines to treat arteriosclerosis, also known as heart disease. His wife would proudly tell her friends that her husband was a super doctor who worked quietly in a neon-lit lab in Geneva to develop all these incredible treatments. From the outside looking in, Jean-Claude's life looked perfect. But looks can be deceiving. In the early morning hours of Monday, January 11th, 1993, Jean-Claude's best friend, Luc, received a call informing him there had been a terrible accident. In the night, a boiler had caught fire inside of Jean-Claude's house, killing his wife and his children. Jean-Claude had barely escaped alive, but when he got to the hospital, he had slipped into a coma. The 2 men had been friends for nearly 20 years. They were both doctors, they both got married at almost the exact same time, their kids had grown up together, and now Jean-Claude's family had been completely destroyed. Later that day, when Luc arrived at the hospital to see his friend, he was met with 2 policemen standing outside of his room, barring anyone from going inside. And when they realized Luc was his best friend, the policemen said, "Hey, can we actually pull you aside and talk to you about Jean-Claude?" And so Luc was confused, but he walked over and sat at a table with the 2 officers, and they proceeded to tell him that the fire that had killed Jean-Claude's family had not been an accident, and Jean-Claude was not a doctor. Jean-Claude had enrolled in medical school in Lyon back in the 1970s, but he failed to show up for his first-year exam, and without passing that exam, you can't advance in medical school, and so the school allowed him to retake the year. And so Jean-Claude did that for 12 consecutive years. All the while, he told his friends and family that he was following normal medical studies, and eventually he told them he had become a doctor. Instead of going to Geneva to discover new medicines for heart disease, Jean-Claude would drive around the border area between France and Switzerland and periodically go to the World Health Organization's Public Information Center and would just walk around the lobby and read pamphlets before going home again. When Jean-Claude went on overseas business trips, he would actually just leave his house, hop on the highway, and stop at a motel, stay there for a couple of days, and then return with gifts. He lived off money from the sale of his student apartment in Lyon that his parents had bought for him. When the money ran out, he asked his friends and family to give him their life savings so he could invest them into these schemes that he knew about because he was a UN employee. And because he's this very successful, reputable doctor, people agreed and gave him their money. But by late 1992, some of his victims were asking for their money, and he didn't have it. And so some of these people began doing some research on Jean-Claude, and they found his name was not listed on the World Health Organization's staff list. By January of 1993, Jean-Claude knew it was only a matter of time before he was exposed. And to this point, he has been living this life for almost 20 years. His wife, his kids, his friends, his parents, everybody, he has told that he's the successful doctor, and that's all about to come crashing down. And the way he handles it is he drives to his parents' house and he kills his parents and their dog, and then drives back to his house and kills his family, takes sleeping pills, and then lights the house on fire. But firefighters were able to get to him and pull him out before he could take his own life. And so after he regained his strength, he was taken into custody and he made a confession. He was convicted of murder in 1996 and given a life sentence. But in 2015, he became eligible for parole, and in 2019, he was released. On September 6, 2006, 51-year-old Susan Kuhnhausen was returning from her job as an emergency room nurse in Portland, Oregon. On the way, she stopped at a hair salon to get her hair dyed. While she waited her turn, she picked up a magazine and a particular quote stood out to her. It said, "I will not live an unlived life. I will not live in fear." At the time, Susan was fighting with her husband, Mike. They had been married for nearly 18 years, and their marriage had become toxic, and Susan had finally gotten the courage up to tell Mike she wanted a divorce, and Mike did not want a divorce. And so they had these bitter, awful fights, and Susan was just looking for things to latch onto, and this type of quote gave her motivation to follow through with this very difficult decision. About an hour later, with her hair now a slightly different color brown, she hopped back in her car and drove the last couple of miles home to her quiet little neighborhood. She pulled into the driveway of her one-story Cape Cod home with their gray picket fence around it. She went in the back door into their mudroom, and right away she saw a note next to the microwave that her husband had left, because at this time they were still living together. And the note just said, "Sue, I've had trouble sleeping. I've gone to the beach. I'll see you in a couple of days." She put the note down and then unlocked the door that led into the house, which was into the kitchen. And as soon as the door opened up, she heard the beeping sound of their security alarm. And then she walked all the way through the house to the front door. She unlocked it, went outside, and then checked their mail, and then went back inside the house. After she got back inside and had shut and locked the front door behind her, she kicked off her shoes and then began walking across the house towards the kitchen. She got about halfway there when she looked over to her left, and she noticed the first floor bedroom that they used as a guest room was really dark. And every morning before she left for work, she would open all the curtains around the house. And so in the evening, the sun would come into the house and it would be nice and bright. And so she's thinking to herself, did I forget to open the curtains in that room? Because it shouldn't be that dark. And as she's staring at the room, a man she didn't recognize walked out from behind the bedroom door and started walking towards her. He was medium height, medium build. He had a hat pulled down over his eyes. He had yellow rubber gloves on, and he was holding a hammer. And he began walking right towards her. For many people, the sight of a stranger inside of your home carrying a hammer would be enough to prompt you to turn around and run out of your house. But not Sue. She had been an emergency room nurse for the past 30 years. And in that time, she had done things like crack open people's ribs to massage their hearts. She had administered IVs and thrashing patients that were suffering from withdrawals. And she and the other nurses she worked with trained regularly in self-defense, because you just never knew what was going to happen in the ER. You needed to be ready to slip chokeholds and defend yourself. And so here Sue was staring down this intruder in her house with 30 years of preparation for this moment. And so Sue ran at this guy faster than he was coming at her, and it caught him off guard. She figured if she could just get up close to him, the power of the hammer strikes would be less. And so she rams into him, and she's about 5'5" and significantly outweighed him. He's about 5'9", maybe 200 pounds. And so she rams him into the wall. He hits her in the head once with the hammer, but it wasn't enough to subdue her or even knock her down. She barely felt it. And so she's holding on to him and she's screaming at him, "Who are you? What do you want?" Because there was a part of her that thought, this is a burglary. I'll just give you what you want. But the guy didn't say anything. And so Susan grabbed him and pushed even harder against the wall. And the man would say 2 words. It was the only 2 words he said the entire time. And it was, "You're strong." And Susan, when she heard that, it was like an adrenaline rush. She knew this guy was not trying to rob her. He was just trying to kill her. And she thought, no, I'm gonna live. And she managed to wrestle the hammer away from him while pinning him against the wall, and then smashed him in the head 3 times with this hammer before he managed to get it back. But when he reached for the hammer, she grabbed his throat and began choking the life out of him. The man immediately went for his throat to get her hand off of him, so he was not trying to attack her. And Susan realized that she had him on the defensive, and she grabbed tighter and tighter around his throat. She moved her other hand up and really started crushing his windpipe. And then she screamed at him, "I'll call an ambulance if you tell me who sent you." And the man looked at her and just grunted at her. And so she continued to squeeze harder and harder until his face turned purple and his eyes rolled back. And she knew as an emergency room nurse, if she continued, she would kill him. And she wasn't really prepared to do that. And so she threw him to the ground. She turned and began to run towards the front door. But this guy jumped up and leapt after her, grabbed her by the ankle, and tripped her to the ground. When she landed, she rolled over onto her back, and right on top of her is this guy wielding the hammer, and he's about to bring it down on her. And so she instinctively just shot up. She sat up as fast as she could, and she bit down as hard as she could on the inner part of his upper leg. She bit so hard she tore through the fabric. And the guy screamed out in pain. He couldn't even hit her with the hammer. He began staggering back, at which point she released the bite, got up onto a knee, and then bit him again on the side of his rib cage as hard as she could, once again tearing through the fabric. And so now this guy is howling at the top of his lungs, at which point Sue grabs him and throws him to the ground, but she falls with him, and she lands directly behind his back. And he's still trying to grab her, and he's got the hammer, and he's trying to hit her. And so she reaches out and puts her arm over his throat and puts him in a wicked chokehold, one that he was not getting out of. And so the guy is trying to fight and get his neck out of the chokehold, but Susan decided that this guy, he's not going to talk, he's not going to tell me what he wants, he's here to kill me, so I'm going to kill him first. And she proceeded to choke him to death. And once he stopped moving, she calmly stood up, looked down, knew he was dead. She grabbed his hammer and then calmly walked out the front door, walked to her neighbor's house, knocked on the door, and then her neighbor comes up and sees Sue just standing there with her clothes tattered and she's all bruised and bloodied, but she looks like she's totally okay. And the neighbor asks Sue, what are you doing? What's going on? Why do you have that hammer? And Sue would tell her that, well, I had an intruder and he tried to kill me, so I killed him. And I need to use your phone to call the police. And so her neighbor's like, okay, come on in and use my phone. And so Sue walks in with her hammer in hand and calmly calls the police and tells them what happened. Police and paramedics show up and they go inside of Sue's house and they confirm that her attacker was in fact dead. And her attacker turned out to be 59-year-old Ed Haffey, who was a Vietnam veteran with a long rap sheet. They discovered Ed's backpack inside of Susan's house, and in it was a notebook that contained instructions for what to do after he killed Susan. And one of those instructions was to call Mike. It turns out this Mike was Susan's husband. He had paid Ed $50,000 to kill his wife. And Mike, earlier in the day, had gone to the house and allowed Ed in and told him where to go and where to wait. And then on his way out, he had written that note saying, I'll see you in a couple of days. When police brought Mike in, he initially denied all charges and said he had nothing to do with this. But he would eventually confess and then would be sentenced to 7 years in prison for soliciting to murder his wife. Although Mike never gave his exact motivations for why he actually did this, he would have been ruined financially during this divorce, but if Susan were to die, he would inherit the house. Immediately after his sentencing, Susan sued Mike for $1 million, claiming she wanted to make sure he didn't have any more money so that he couldn't go hire another hitman to finish the job. Susan didn't have to worry for very long though, because Mike would die shortly thereafter in prison. As for Susan, she never faced any criminal charges and in fact was hailed as a hero in the wake of the attack. Richard Russell, better known as Bebo by his friends and family, was born in 1989 in Key West, Florida, but at the age of 7, he moved to Wasilla, Alaska. He was a standout athlete at Wasilla High School, competing in football and in track and field. After graduating in 2008, he moved to Coos Bay, Oregon, where he briefly attended a community college. While he was there, he met a woman named Hannah Strassner, and in 2011, they got married. And shortly after that, they opened a bakery that they would run together for 3 years. Hannah, who had gone to culinary school, was very detail-oriented and ran the show at the bakery. Bebo, on the other hand, was not professionally trained and was much more laid back and interested in experimenting with new and wild recipes. In 2015, with heavy hearts, they decided to sell the bakery so they could move to Seattle and be closer to Hannah's family. Once they arrived there, Bebo got a job at the SeaTac airport as a ground service agent for Horizons Airline. It was not a job he necessarily wanted, but they needed the cash. After working at Horizons Air for 4 years as a ramper, someone that moves the luggage in and out of the aircraft, Bebo was given some additional responsibility. They asked him to be on a 2-person tow team. A tow team is in charge of moving airplanes around in between their flights. And so the way this works is one person goes down and drives the actual tow vehicle and hooks that up to the airplane and begins moving it around, and the other person would go up into the cockpit, turn the plane on, and then work a couple of very basic systems to help get the plane to go where it needs to go. The members of a tow team are one of the very few number of people that are allowed to go into the cockpit of an aircraft by themselves. And so Bebo really relished this opportunity, and when he was up there, he found himself fascinated with all the controls, and any chance he got, he would ask a pilot if they were inside of the aircraft to teach him what some of these controls were. But one time, Bebo was flipping some of the switches in the cockpit that he was not supposed to touch, that other pilots had told him about, and the pilot of this particular plane caught him doing it, took exception to it, and reported him. But surprisingly, there were no repercussions. It was just really embarrassing for Bebo. Like many of the other ground service agents working at Horizon Airlines, Bebo was generally unhappy with his job. He felt like it was boring, that there wasn't much upward mobility, and that he was criminally underpaid. But there was one redeeming quality of his job, and that was, in virtue of working for an airline, he got all sorts of free airfare. And so not only did he get to fly for free all over the world, he got to fly basically anytime he wanted up to Alaska to visit his hometown and see his family, something that was very important to him. The people that knew Bebo said he had a great sense of humor, he was extremely friendly, and you could always catch him with his head buried in a book. And his coworkers would say he had aspirations to be an officer in the military. And when all those people that knew Bebo the best were asked, why do you think he did what he did on August 10th, 2018, none of them have an answer. On that fateful day, at 1:35 p.m. local time, a passenger airplane owned by Horizon Airlines flew into SeaTac Airport, where Bebo worked. And so this plane was not scheduled to fly for the rest of the day, so it was taxied to the far north section of the airport to a parking spot called Cargo 1. At 7:15 p.m. that evening, Bebo arrived at Cargo 1, and he climbed inside the empty aircraft and made his way into the cockpit. He followed the startup procedure until the plane was on and the propellers were starting to turn. He hopped out of the plane, got in his tow vehicle, and used it to turn the plane around so its nose was pointed towards the airfield. He moved the tow vehicle out of the way and then climbed back inside the aircraft, shut it behind him, and got in the cockpit and began taxiing out towards the runway. For the next few minutes, air traffic control bombarded Bebo over the radio, asking him, "What are you doing? This is unauthorized movement. You should not be heading towards the runway right now." But Bebo never responded. Instead, he just continued on until he reached the beginning of the runway, at which point, despite having no flight experience, minus some video games and fiddling with some switches in the cockpit while he was in the tow team, he managed to go full throttle and get this plane careening down the runway and successfully took off. But that was nothing compared to what he did next. Over the course of his 1 hour-long flight, he expertly performed backflips and barrel rolls and these huge loops in the sky, dangerous maneuvers that even expert pilots might risk stalling the plane and crashing. But he didn't. It was like he'd been doing this his whole life. Onlookers on the ground were shocked to see this passenger airline performing these ridiculous stunts so low to the ground that all over Seattle, you had people filming this plane and posting it to social media. So in real time, it was like the world was made aware of Bebo up in the sky. And so people went outside and just watched as he flew around. But the real story is not the aerial stunts that Bebo was pulling in the sky. It was the strange, calm conversation that Bebo had with the air traffic controller the whole time he was up in the sky. The extremely professional, very calm air traffic controller tries to convince Bebo that he really needs to come down and land this aircraft. And he begins telling him where he can go, different airfields, and if he needs to, he can land out in the Puget Sound. But Bebo kind of laughs it off and says, "You know, I wasn't really ever trying to land this plane. I just wanted to do a couple maneuvers before I put it down." And so as Bebo soared through the sky, this controller tries in vain to convince Bebo to stop what he's doing, and Bebo's just completely ignoring him and cracking jokes with him and telling him how he just loves the scenery up there and how beautiful it is. And then at one point, Bebo becomes remorseful, and he says to the controller that he really hopes he hasn't ruined his day, and he feels really bad for the people that he's inevitably going to hurt. And then in Bebo's most poignant moment, he tells the controller that he's just a broken guy, and he's got a couple of screws loose, and he didn't know it until now. Towards the end of the flight, Bebo tells the controller that he's going to try for one more barrel roll, and if it goes well, he's going to go nose down and call it a night. The controller tries to convince him that it's still possible to try to land, but at this point, Bebo's not listening. At 8:45 p.m., the nose of the plane was seen pointed straight down at the earth. 1 minute later, at 8:46 p.m., Bebo intentionally crashed into a small island off the coast of Seattle. He was the only fatality in the crash. Here is a condensed version of some of the commentary between Bebo and the air traffic controller, along with some of the real footage of him flying the plane.
I just kind of want to do a couple maneuvers, see what it can do before I put her down, you know?
Approach welcome, final runway 16 right.
Welcome. Man, I'm a ground service agent. I don't know what that is.
There is the runway just off your right side in about a mile. Do you see that?
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to land it. I wasn't really planning on landing it. I got a lot of people that care about me, and it's going to disappoint them to hear that I did this. I would like to apologize to each and every one of them. Just a broken guy. Got a few screws loose, I guess. Never really knew it until now. I think I'm gonna try to do a barrel roll, and if that goes good, I'll just go nose down and call it a night.
How Bebo was able to take off and fly around and pull these stunts without any formal training remains a mystery. Some people believe he was planning this for a long time, which is why whenever he was in the cockpit, when he was in the tow team, he would ask pilots to explain the different switches and toggles and how to use them, and he would feign that he was just curious, when in reality he was actually trying to learn how to fly the plane. As for the incredible stunts he was doing, it's believed he did learn those in a video game. But even if this is true, that he learned how to fly a plane by asking a couple questions and playing video games, the chances of it working out and actually successfully taking off and doing what he did are astronomically low. Normal people can't do that. And that's why the internet gave Bebo a new nickname to commemorate the fact that basically no one could have done this but him. And so they named him the Sky King. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house and steal all of their sweatpants strings. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's story is about a crime so horrific that a judge handed down a sentence that had never been given before in Australian history. This story is exceptionally graphic. As such, viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to spray the like button's face with sunscreen, but instead use bear spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Before we get into today's story, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Honey. Are you tired of paying full price for your bear spray? Me too. That's why I started using Honey. Honey, like bear spray, is one of those things that you don't realize you need until you have it. Then you're like, how did I ever live without this thing? Honey, which is completely free, automatically scours the internet for discount codes and coupons for nearly anything you happen to be shopping for online. It's genius. Use Honey, save money. And just think, with all that honey money you're going to be saving, you can finally upgrade from bear spray to dinosaur spray. So if you want to be like me and continue to bring the good fight to the like button, go ahead and add Honey for free to your browser by going to joinhoney.com/ballin. Okay, let's get into today's story. In 1955, Catherine Knight had the misfortune of being born into a highly dysfunctional and abusive household. Not only was she badly mistreated by her alcoholic parents and cruel older siblings, she was also scorned by the people who lived in the town with her simply because they didn't like her family. Catherine lived in a very small town in New South Wales, Australia, where basically everybody knew each other's business. But despite the abuse, Catherine always tried to focus on the future. She would tell herself that as much as my life is miserable right now, in the future I will have a family of my own and I will take care of them the way I wish my family had taken care of me. But when Catherine became a young woman and began dating men, all of her relationships would always crash and burn because inevitably she and her partner would become toxic and abusive, and it would end the relationship. It was like Catherine both didn't know how to be a quality partner and didn't know how to identify a quality partner, likely because she didn't know what that looked like. She had been raised in this horrible household. But in 1995, when Catherine was 40 and really starting to feel desperate for someone to actually love and to love her back, she would meet a man named John Price, who was also 40, and he just seemed fundamentally different than every other man she had ever dated. He was empathetic to her troubled past, and he seemed to really care for her and really wanted to kind of take her under his wing and love her. And so immediately Catherine just fell head over heels in love with John, and in return it seemed very much like John had fallen head over heels in love with Catherine. That year, Catherine moved into John's house where he lived with his 3 young daughters, who right away took a liking to her. And so for the first time, Catherine felt like her life was really going the way she wanted it to go. But unfortunately, this would not last. Despite the seemingly perfect start to Catherine and John's relationship, it eventually began to sour when Catherine began to ask John if they were ever going to get married. Catherine really wanted to get married. She wanted to kind of officially have a family of her own that she could take care of, but John was weary of marriage because he had just left a failed marriage, and he told Catherine that realistically, he might never want to get married again. And so over time, this issue really drove the two apart, and it all came to a head in early February of 2000 when John and Catherine were at his house. They were in the kitchen, and they got into a heated fight over marriage, and then before long, they were both getting physical with each other. And during this altercation, Catherine kind of scrambled and grabbed a knife on the counter and actually slashed John across the chest. And as soon as she did this, the fight came to an end. John screamed at her to leave the apartment and never come back, but Catherine was already storming out of the apartment. They both understood that a line had been crossed, and almost certainly their relationship was now over. But over the following days and weeks, Catherine, who had moved into a different apartment at this time, kind of near where John was living, she felt very lonely, and even though she knew her relationship with John was not a healthy one, she longed to patch things up with him. She didn't like being alone. She wanted to have that family. And so she decided she would do what she had previously done in other relationships to kind of patch up the relationship after a fight. And so the way she would do this is she would kind of make sure they had the house to themselves, and then she would show up in lingerie, and they would have kind of an intimate makeup moment, and then everything would go back to normal. So on February 29th, Catherine waited until she knew John had left for work, and she went over to his place, and she had a key to it still, and she went inside, and his 3 daughters were there. And so Catherine said hello, and she chatted with the kids for a minute, and then she made arrangements for the 3 kids to go get picked up by a babysitter and spend the night outside of the house. And so then when the babysitter came by the house and picked up the 3 girls, Catherine said goodbye to them, and then Catherine left John's place, and she went out to get her lingerie. Later in the evening, when John came back to his house, he went inside, and he found his kids weren't there, but there was a note from Catherine that explained where his kids were and how she wanted to make up with him, and she would be back in a little while. Now, John was not happy about this. He was angry that she had decided to just come into his house without asking him. That felt very violating. And then also she made a decision about his kids without talking to him. That just felt so offensive and wrong of her to do. And so John grabs a beer out of the fridge, he sits down in the living room, and he begins to wait for Catherine to show up. The next morning at 6 a.m., John was supposed to be at work already, but he wasn't. And so his company, who knew he was very reliable, were concerned something was wrong. And so they sent a worker to his property to see what was going on. And so the worker, he pulls up in front of John's house. John's car is in the driveway. And so the worker's first thought is, oh, I guess John must have overslept. And so the worker walks up onto John's front porch and he knocks on John's front door, but there's no answer. And so the worker knocks again, still no answer. And so this guy turns around to leave and go back and tell the company, look, I don't know what's going on. But as he's turning around, he notices on the very bottom of the outside of the door, kind of near the edge, the front edge of this door, there looked to be some blood on the outside of the door. It was pretty easy to tell it was blood. And so the worker was immediately very concerned, and he knocked again on the door, but no answer. And so he ran around to the side of the building and he began banging on the windows of John's house to hopefully rouse whoever was in there to come out and to make sure things were okay, but there was silence. And so the worker ran back to his car, he drove back to his office, and after he told his boss what he had found, they decided they had to call the police. The police would show up at John's residence at 8 a.m., and when they got there, John's vehicle was still in the driveway, the house was quiet and dark, and so the police, they walked up to the front door, they knocked on the door, there's no answer, it's silence, and so they walk around to the back of the property to try the back door, and as they're walking into the backyard, they see in the middle of the grass, right behind a window that led into the house, there was this plate of food that had been clearly thrown out of the house and landed face down on the grass. And so the police see that, they're thinking that's pretty weird, and so what they do first, before even going to the back door, is they turn to the window, which clearly the food had been thrown out of, but whoever had done it had then shut the window. And so they go over to the glass and press their faces up against it and peer inside. And there's no John, there's no people, there's nothing inside, it's dark. But right inside of this window is this big dining room table, and it's covered with this amazing spread of food. It looks like a Thanksgiving Day meal had been prepared, but then no one had eaten from it. And so they're thinking, okay, well, for whatever reason, one of these plates of food was thrown out the window. That's very odd. And so the police come off the window, they walk over to the back door, they knock a few more times, but after even more silence, they kick the back door down and they go inside. As soon as they step in, there's two officers. They walk straight into the house with the dining room table with all that food on their left, and there's nothing that stands out. They're calling for John, it's silent, everything is off, everything is quiet, and they keep on walking into what appears to be the living room where the TV is and where there's a couch, and as soon as they walk in, they see there's blood everywhere. And towards the front of the living room, where the front door actually opened into the house, there was a very obvious pool of blood. Basically, if you stepped into the house, you'd be stepping into this puddle of blood. And as they're looking at this pool of blood, they see there is a distinct blood trail from the pool back into the living room that they have just walked into, and the trail kind of leads behind a couch out of their view. And so they walk around the couch to see what's at the end of this trail, and they find Catherine Knight's crumpled body on the ground. And so right away they rush over to her and they feel for a pulse, and they discover that she actually does have a pulse, but very obviously she's clinging to life, barely. And so one of the officers stays with Catherine while they're calling in paramedics to come in and deal with her, while the other officer draws their weapon and they begin searching the rest of the house. And so the officer walks past the front door on their left, and they go into the other side of the first floor, which is basically like this lounge room, kind of like a secondary living room. And as they're looking out across this room, they see there's no one in it, but there appears to be this curtain blocking the entrance to some other side room. And this officer, as they're looking at it, they look down and they notice there's another blood trail that starts from the front of the house. It snakes all the way across this lounge room and kind of disappears into this covered up room. And so this officer yells out for John, but there's no answer. And so he ends up going all the way across, checking as he's going, looking around, but there's no one there. And he gets to this towel, and with his non-shooting hand, he kind of pushes it out of the way, and he looks inside of this space. And it turns out to just be a small closet. There was nothing of note inside. It didn't really make sense that the blood trail had led to this closet. But then, as the officer is kind of wondering why the blood trail ended here, he started to feel something cold on his non-shooting arm. And so he looked down at his arm, and he saw there was this huge streak of blood on his arm. And he knew he had not been wounded in some way. This was not his blood. So how did he get blood all over him? And then he stepped back in horror, because he realized the curtain that he had just moved with the arm that had blood on it was not a curtain. The night before, John sat in his living room waiting for Catherine to return, very angrily waiting for her to come back. But by 11 p.m., she hadn't. And John, he works super early in the morning. He's very tired. He decides to just go to bed. And so he climbs into bed, he falls asleep. And then about an hour or so later, Catherine would walk into the bedroom. She had her black lingerie on that she had bought earlier in the day. And even though John was furious with her and very upset with what she had done that day, seeing her like this suddenly made him think, you know what, all my issues with her can wait. And before long, they were getting intimate together in the bed, and then they fell asleep in each other's arms. Later in the night, Catherine would wake up. John's still fast asleep, so she's looking right at him, and she suddenly has this intense sense of disgust. She was convinced that he was taking advantage of her. That the reason he didn't want to marry her was he was just kind of using her. And this anger inside of her boiled up, and she decided right then and there that I need to teach this man a lesson he will never forget. And so Catherine very quietly slipped out of the bed. John's still sleeping. She snuck out of the bedroom. She made her way out of the house, and she got into her car, and she drove across town to the apartment she had been staying in for the past couple of weeks, and she grabbed her work tools. Catherine, where she worked full-time, was a meat processing factory, and she worked on the kill floor with the animals that are being turned into meat. And so her skill set was butchering, and her tools were butcher's knives. And so she grabs her kit of butcher's knives, and she drives back to John's place. She goes into the house, she makes her way into the kitchen, and she unrolls this kit full of different sized butcher knives, and she picks the one she wants, she pulls it out, she makes sure it's nice and sharp, and then she made her way into John's bedroom. When she got into his bedroom, John was still asleep. He was lying on his back, covers up over him, fast asleep, and she climbed onto the bed, being very careful not to wake him. And then when she was straddling him kind of on her knees right over his midsection, she raised the knife up between her two hands and she brought it down into his chest. John immediately shot up, bucking Catherine off of him. She went flying onto the floor, and then instinctively John just begins running out of his bedroom. He has no idea what's happening. He's been stabbed, but he probably can't even feel it. It's all adrenaline. He is just running through the house. But by the time he gets to the front of the house, the blood loss had caused him to be so weak he could barely stand. And so he managed to open the front door, but then he collapsed onto the ground halfway between the inside and outside of the house. And so laying there, he reached out with his bloody hand and he grabbed the edge of the door that was partially open and tried to pull himself out of the house. And that's how that bloody print was left on the outside of the door that the worker saw. And as he's trying to pull himself out of the house, Catherine, who had gotten up after being knocked off the bed, she ran to the front of the house and she grabbed his legs and she pulled him back into the house and then shut the door. And then once he was inside, she got on top of him and stabbed him an additional 36 times all over his body. And then she left him there to bleed to death. And so while he's dying, she goes into the kitchen and she puts on a large pot of water to boil. And then she began setting the plates all around the dining room table for a big family meal. After she was done setting the table, she went back over to John, who was now deceased at this point, and she dragged him all the way across that lounge room on the other side of the house that the officer walked through and then found that curtain. She dragged him all the way across that room to right in front of that closet, and then using her expert skills from working in the meat factory, she proceeded to skin John from his neck all the way down to his toe. And she was so good at it that she was able to skin him in one piece. And she took this skin suit and she draped it over the entrance to this closet. And then she removed John's head from the now skinned torso and she placed it in the water that she had put on to boil earlier. She was going to use his head to turn it into some sort of broth or gravy. And then she grabbed his skinned torso and dragged it into the kitchen and began butchering it and then making different dishes with his meat, different pies and casseroles. And then after she had made this enormous feast out of John's body, she set the food all around the table that she had already laid out, and then she made little placards, little name cards that had the names of each of John's children on them, and she placed them in front of each of the plates because her intention was to feed them their father. And then Catherine sat down at a plate that she had made for herself and she began eating John, except it made her sick, and so she opened the window behind her and she threw her plate of food out into the backyard. And then when she turned back around and looked at what she had done, she decided that instead of facing the consequences, she would just take her own life. And so she went into the bathroom, she grabbed some sleeping pills, and then she cut across the front of the house, walking through that pool of blood near the door. She made her way into the living room, she overdosed on sleeping pills, and collapsed on the ground. However, when the paramedics finally showed up the following morning, they were able to save her. And so once she stabilized in the hospital, she was promptly arrested for John's murder. She would ultimately be found guilty, however, she would never take any responsibility. And then during her sentencing phase, she was given life in prison, but the judge made a special clause just for her. He told them that her file needed to be stamped, literally stamped, never to be released. Basically, there was no hope ever of her getting out of prison. And so after she was taken away, she would become the first woman in Australian history to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She is still alive today. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to spray the like button's face with sunscreen, but instead use bear spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast that puts out weekly brand new content that you can only get on the podcast. It's called the MrBallen's Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, and it's available on Spotify, iTunes, Apple, Amazon, basically anywhere you get a podcast, that's where you'll find it. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me and then message me on any major social media platform. My username for all of them is MrBallen, and I really do read the bulk of my direct messages. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen's Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page that puts out near daily content. It's just called MrBallen. We also have a Snapchat channel that puts out episodes on Sundays. We have some very cool merch. Go over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. If you have a story suggestion, please drop it in our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, Snapchat, podcasts, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's stories are about real people who try to control fate, and what they end up doing is just causing historic levels of destruction. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to reorganize the like button's pantry for them. But instead of actually doing that, just remove all the labels from their canned goods. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of June 26, 1826, 38-year-old Samuel Willie Jr. stepped out of his house in a remote area of New Hampshire's White Mountain Range called the Notch. His wife, Polly, was at his side, and together they looked around in shock because the land surrounding their home was almost completely destroyed. There had been a huge storm the previous night, and so Sam and Polly had been expecting some damage. But what they were seeing now was far worse than they had imagined. The heavy rain had caused the river in front of their home to completely overflow, so half of their property was now completely submerged in water. The deluge had also triggered a rock slide from one side of the mountain slopes behind them, so there were also rocks and mud and entire trees that were now kind of littering their yard and adjacent fields. Sam saw, luckily, the slide had missed their house and the barn where they kept their livestock, but only barely. And there was damage to those structures from the storm itself that he would have to repair. So Sam began calculating how much time and money it was going to take to clean all this up. And next to him, he heard Polly kind of mumble to herself that this had all been a really bad idea. Sam sighed because he knew that Polly was referring to their decision to move to the Notch in the first place. And right now, staring at all this awful destruction right in front of him, he had to agree with her. This might have been a terrible idea. So up until about a year ago, Sam and Polly and their 5 kids had lived on a farm about 20 miles away from where they were right now, and it had been a very quiet, cozy life. But Sam had always had this feeling that he wanted to do something more exciting than just be a regular old farmer. And with this house in the Notch, he'd seen an opportunity for adventure, and also an opportunity to make some money. So in this part of the White Mountain Range, there was a 12-mile-long road that cut through the range from one side to the other. And the Notch house was right in the middle of that road. But since this was the year 1826, this road was more like a glorified trail. It was mountainous and rocky, and neither horses nor wagons could make it all the way through. So as a result, travelers were typically on foot. And there was literally nowhere to stop on this whole 12-mile road except for the Willie's Notch house. So Sam had realized how valuable this Notch house could be if he converted it into an inn. But he also had bigger aspirations for the place, like beyond it just being a pit stop. He wanted to turn it into a destination. After all, the White Mountains were incredibly beautiful, and where the Willies lived in the Notch was no exception. Their house was right on a riverbank in a mountain valley, surrounded on all sides by the woods and towering mist-covered peaks. It was all honestly breathtaking. And as soon as Sam had seen it, he knew that it could be a famous destination for poets and authors and artists because it was the kind of place people would write songs and books about. I mean, it was perfect. But so far, his dream, of coming out here to the Notch House had been a lot of work. The house was large, but really old, and it had been abandoned for a while before he and his family got there, so it was in really bad shape and quite dilapidated. Sam had hired 2 men to live on the property and help him fix it up, and they'd already done some work to expand the house and the barn to accommodate more travelers. But Sam knew he still had a lot to do before the Notch House became some kind of artist's retreat. And now, with this extensive damage from the most recent storm, he had even more things to fix, which he also had to admit was actually the least of his problems. Because as he and his wife Polly looked around at the aftermath of the storm, he knew, really, he was lucky that their house was even still standing, and that he and his family were even still alive. I mean, that storm was catastrophic. And as Sam thought about how close they'd come to death, his heart began to race. I mean, he wondered if Polly was right, and they should really, at this point, just pack the family up and go back to simple farming, because it was safer. But leaving meant sort of admitting failure. His big dream would be over. There would be no artist's retreat, no tourist mecca. He would not be some creative benefactor. He'd just be a farmer. So he took a deep breath, and then he asked his wife to please give this place one more chance. He promised he would do everything he possibly could to not just repair the property, but also make it safe and secure so it could withstand whatever the mountain threw at them. And Polly hesitated, but ultimately she believed in her husband, and she nodded in agreement. For the next 2 months, Sam and his 2 hired workers worked practically around the clock repairing the damage from the storm. They fixed up windows and shingles and cleared away all the debris, which took forever. And then once all the repairs were done, Sam continued working, but now he focused on improving the property. As the weeks passed by, he worked very hard to build his family a very secure home so they'd be much safer against future storms. He reinforced walls and built a whole new roof and mapped out disaster scenarios so that he and his family would always be prepared. One disaster scenario that he was especially concerned about was the large boulder that was right behind their house. He was worried that if there was another big rock slide, that boulder might just topple onto them and crush them. And he and his workers soon realized that they couldn't actually move the boulder. It was just way too big. But in the end, they found a very creative way to make sure it would not be dangerous. And while Sam did all this work, he started to feel a lot better about everything. Each security measure he put in place was proof that he didn't have to sacrifice his ambitions for his family's safety. He could have both. A few weeks later, on the night of August 28th, Sam Willie stood by a downstairs window watching another wild storm rage outside. Heavy rain pummeled the glass, and Sam could hear powerful wind battering the sides of the house. It was pitch black out, but every now and then there was a burst of lightning that would light the whole valley up for a few seconds before it went dark again. Each time this happened, a crash of thunder would follow that was so loud it shook the house down to its foundation. Behind Sam, Polly, along with their 5 kids and the 2 men that were working on the property, were all sitting at the kitchen table. And Polly and the kids in particular were very scared, and the whole group were reading Bible verses, in these kind of frantic hushed tones, like they were trying to, will the storm to be over and to cling on to their faith, to pray that they'd be okay. Sam could hear the fear in his wife's voice, and he really couldn't blame her, because this was quite possibly the strongest storm that either of them had ever seen out here. It was even bigger than that one that completely destroyed their property over the summer. The rain seemed impossibly powerful, coming down so hard and so fast that the river had already overflowed. And each time there was a burst of lightning, Sam could see the water levels were getting higher and higher almost by the second. And so Sam was admittedly quite scared himself. He tried to keep that in, but his heart was racing and he was really anxious. But he told himself that this was the moment he'd prepared for all summer long. I mean, this was it. He had done so much work to make sure this was a safe place during storms. And he felt like they'd be okay. But at the same time, the deafening sounds outside and the terrified voices of Polly and his kids were making it really hard to believe that was actually true, that they were really okay here. So for a little while, Sam just kept looking out the window, listening to his family behind him, but then eventually he turned around, and as calm as he could, he told them all to go to bed. It was going to be fine. He would stay up and keep watch. Polly, who was visibly still very scared, nodded and got up and went off with the kids. And for the next few hours, Sam stayed at his post by the window and watched the storm. And for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of drama. I mean, it was very loud and windy. It was obvious the river was flooding. I mean, there was going to be damage tomorrow, but Sam was thinking that, maybe we're going to get through this thing. But a little after midnight, Sam heard this sudden, extremely loud banging sound outside, and he froze because he knew it was not thunder. It sounded more like an explosion. Almost immediately, Sam knew what it had to have been. The barn must have collapsed. And thinking that this storm had just taken out an entire building that he had reinforced for a storm, turned Sam's worry into outright panic. And so Sam screams for his wife and the workers and his kids to wake up, that it's not safe, get away from the windows, we have to find cover. And so for the next few seconds, the family and the workers, everyone's frantically scrambling around, trying to find a safe spot, but they don't know where it is. But as they're sort of navigating, trying to find the right place to go to weather the storm, Sam heard an even louder bang, and then there were screams all around him, and then he felt himself go airborne as a heavy object slammed into his back. The following evening, an exhausted traveler named John Barker walked down that road in the direction of the Notch House where the Willies lived. So John was a merchant, and he was passing through the White Mountains on his way home after a business trip. And he had made this trip many times before. He knew the road, but the road currently was flooded and there was rock slides and damage everywhere, so it was quite slow going and pretty miserable. But he knew at the halfway point was this house, the Notch House, where Sam Willie and his family lived, and they were looking to convert their house into an inn for travelers. And even though it wasn't fully established yet, John knew he could very likely get into that house, have a hot meal, rest a little bit before he made the rest of his journey. But when he finally rounded the corner into the valley where the house was, he just froze because the area was a complete disaster. The river had clearly completely flooded, and now half the land in front of him was just underwater. There had also been clearly a huge rock slide. The barn was only half standing, and the field in front of the Willies was completely buried in rocks and mountain debris. But the truly astonishing thing was that in the middle of all this destruction and ruin, the Willies' house was still standing. And as John maneuvered his way closer to it, he realized it was more than just intact. The house was pristine. There wasn't a single thing broken or out of place, not even a window. Relieved and a little amazed, John hurried right up to the entrance and knocked. But no one answered. So eventually he just opened the door and poked his head in and called out to Sam. But he didn't hear anything. No sound of a reply and nobody moving around inside. So John tentatively stepped all the way into the house and just kept calling out to the family as he walked from room to room. But he quickly realized the house was completely empty. It was also a mess. There were clothes scattered all over the floor and beds, and sheets had been yanked around and were messy, and the Bible was wide open on the kitchen table. John stood in the middle of the home trying to work out what could have happened here. The mess suggested that, clearly the family had been here somewhat recently, but had left in a hurry. So John guessed they must have gone down the mountain to wait out the storm somewhere else, either at a neighbor's or the tavern, miles away at the end of the road. And since the Willies were not here to allow him to stay, John needed to figure out what he was going to do. I mean, he didn't really like the idea of still sleeping in the home without them here. But he really had nowhere else to go. And it was almost nighttime, and he could barely manage the ruined road during the daylight, let alone during the dark. So even though he felt kind of bad about it, he picked a bed and tried to get some rest. But just as he began to drift off, he heard a deep, guttural moaning sound coming from somewhere outside the house. John immediately woke up and rushed over to a window. But he couldn't see anything. Night came really fast in the White Mountains, and it was almost completely dark outside. He waited to see if he would hear anything else, but he didn't. So he decided he must have imagined the sound and turned to go back to bed. But as he did, the moaning started again, and this time it was louder. John gasped as a terrible thought occurred to him. He wondered if maybe the sound was one of the Willies and that they hadn't actually left the property, but were maybe outside, injured or in trouble because of this storm. So John sprinted outside, but again, it was pitch black outside and he didn't have any kind of light to help guide his way. And so once he was out there, he just began shouting out, calling out to whoever it was, asking if they needed help. And eventually, the horrible moaning answered him. But the moaning kind of echoed all over the valley, so John couldn't pinpoint where it was actually coming from, other than it clearly being outside somewhere. After frantically looking around and not finding whoever it was, John realized that finding the injured person was going to be impossible right now. It was just too dark, and he would unfortunately have to wait until the morning. So, very reluctantly, John went back inside the house, and for hours he just sat in bed and listened to the moaning continue outside. Finally, in the morning, when the first bit of sun peeked over the mountain ridge, John hurried right outside to look around. And this time, he quickly found the source of that moaning sound. It was one of the Willys' oxen, moaning in pain from being trapped under some debris near the ruins of their barn. John immediately rushed forward and began hauling the wooden planks and rocks off the ox. And after he had freed the animal, it amazingly staggered to its feet and hobbled away into the woods. It was basically okay. But after it was gone, John felt this sort of sick uneasiness, even though the sound had been from an ox and he had saved it. He just felt like there was something wrong here, and so he decided that he had to go and see the Willys with his own eyes, just to make sure they really were okay. So even though it was really early and John was still very tired, he immediately gathered up his things and set off down the road. Hours later, around noon that same day, John Barker finally staggered out of the mostly destroyed pass and made his way towards the tavern at the bottom of the road. When John stepped inside, he was exhausted, he was drenched, from this awful journey he had just taken again on this road. But more than that, he was really worried about the Willys, because as he made that trip down the road, he saw neighbors' homes along the way and kind of expected to see the Willys in one of them. But no, the Willys were not in any of the neighbors' homes, and in fact, basically none of the neighbors were in their houses either. They were all basically in this tavern. It was like everybody who lived on this road had come to this tavern because of the storm. But when John looked around the tavern, he could tell the Willys were not in there either. And this made John's stomach drop. Because if they weren't at their house, and they weren't in any of the neighbors' homes, and now they were not in this tavern with the rest of their neighbors, that had to mean something was wrong. And so John actually called out to the entire room and asked if anyone had seen the Willys since the storm. And the tavern got really quiet as its occupants all began looking around at each other, seeing if anybody had, but eventually everyone just shook their head and said, no, we don't know where they are. And that's when John said to the crowd that, well, the Willys are missing. A few hours later, a 12-man search party left that tavern and headed right back up the road towards the Notch. They were led by one of the Willys' neighbors, a man named Edward Melcher, who lived at the base of the mountain on a farm with his family. The recent storm had done quite a bit of damage to Edward's property, and so he and his family, like most other people that lived in this area, had gone to the tavern to seek shelter. Edward and his family, much like the Willys, were good people who were just trying to carve out a living in this part of the world. And there were not a lot of people doing that. I mean, this was a very small community, and so they always helped each other out whenever they could. And so this was no exception. But as desperately as Edward and the rest of the search party wanted to get to the Willys' property and find these people, it took so long to navigate the road that by the time they actually got to the property, it was after midnight and really too dark to look for anything. So they just went right into the Willys' house to wait until morning. Once he was inside, Edward could see, the home really was just as John described. It was sort of a mess, but there was absolutely no damage to it from the storm. Edward had heard that Sam was really freaked out about a storm that they had had earlier that summer, and because of that storm and because of the damage it had done, he had gone way out of his way to really develop his property to prepare it for the next storm. And it seemed like all his preparations and reinforcements on his land had paid off, because here his house was standing tall. But that was also kind of confusing. It's like, if you prepared this house for a storm, and clearly it was able to withstand the storm, why did the Willys leave? As Edward continued to walk around the house, he saw that the Willys' Bible was still lying on the kitchen table wide open, and when he leaned over and read the passage that was on the page, he couldn't help but, kind of shiver when he saw what it said. It said, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." Hours later, when the sun finally began to come up, Edward and the others went outside and began searching the property for signs of the Willies. And over the next few hours, the original party of 12 grew as more and more people showed up to assist in the search. By this point, word had spread pretty far about the family's disappearance, and so residents from all over the White Mountains had come here to help. And eventually, hundreds of people were combing the mountainside to find the Willies, or at least to find a clue about where they might have gone. At around noon, when still there had been nothing found, Edward decided he would go search closer to the river, since by this point, the water levels had gone down some. And when he got to the water's edge, he began to hear this strange buzzing sound, and so he followed it, and eventually, he saw something poking out from behind some debris. And when he saw what it was, Edward began to scream for help. So the thing that Sam Willie was most afraid of happening in a large storm was a rock slide, especially with that huge boulder positioned right behind his house. But when Sam realized it was going to be impossible to move said boulder, or otherwise shield his family from falling mountain rocks, he came up with a pretty creative solution. He built a whole second shelter that he and his family could run to if there was a bad storm. And when that second storm hit, the one that had caused all this damage and had led to the Willies' disappearance, well, during that storm, Sam's screaming for his family to, take cover, get away from the windows. He's heard this crashing sound outside that he is convinced is the sound of his barn collapsing, and, his house is next. He's yelling for them to take cover. Well, the family listened to him, and together they did seek cover. They left the main house and went into that second shelter that they believed was better protected from a potential rock slide. But unfortunately, this would be a catastrophic mistake, because that humongous boulder right behind the house was not actually a safety risk. In many ways, it was like a protective barrier. When there was an actual rock slide during this horrible storm, well, the rubble actually piled up on the backside of that boulder and did not strike the house at all. And so in essence, this boulder basically made the Willies' original home the single safest place to be on the whole property. But unfortunately, Sam and his family did not stay there long enough to realize that. They ran out of the main house as a big group, and as soon as they were outside, they were overtaken by the rock slide and killed. Eventually, the residents of the White Mountains would find the family. The buzzing that Edward heard was actually a group of flies gathered around a single human hand reached out from underneath the rubble. Ultimately, because of this tragedy, the area became a famous tourist destination, just like the Willies had hoped it would. People from all over the country heard about the family and what happened, and before long, artists and authors were coming to the White Mountains in droves to see the site of the tragedy, and some even wrote books about it. And so, in a sort of cruel twist of fate, Sam's dream did come true, just not in the way he hoped. On one of the last nights in December of 1678, Marie Bosse sat at a large table at a friend's dinner party in the city of Paris, France. The table was crowded with other party guests, and they were all listening to Marie as she told story after story about her life and her career. So Marie was a fortune teller, which meant, at least according to her, that she could read people's futures, usually by reading their palms or using crystals. And Marie was actually quite good at doing this, in the sense that whenever she told someone what their future was going to be, she typically was right, which was why, out of the 400-something fortune tellers in Paris at the time, she had some of the best and most important clients in the whole city. People like royalty and wives of very high-up government members and other very wealthy people of high society. And it was a big deal for Marie to even be in the same room as some of these kinds of people, because she did not come from money. Actually, there was a time where she almost had to live out on the streets, because years ago, when her husband died, she was left alone with her 3 kids and really no way to provide for them. But she'd worked very hard and actually ended up thriving. Her kids had grown up, and she'd turned her fortune-telling talents into a real business. She'd been so successful that she really was maybe about 3 clients away from being able to retire. And Marie was not one to just sit back and let those clients magically find her. She was a self-made woman and knew it was very important to go out and find those clients herself. And so that's why she was at this party now. It was being hosted by a friend of hers who was also in the fortune-telling scene, and so many of the guests at this table were new potential clients that Marie really hoped to impress. So that's what Marie was trying to do now, to try to be very impressive. She was telling the other guests all these incredible tales about working with the rich and the famous. But the problem was, in addition to these fabulous stories she was telling, what was also coming through very clearly to the audience was that Marie was very drunk. So Marie was loud and talkative in general, and that extroverted attitude really helped her get clients typically. But when she got drunk, she was even more talkative than normal. And sometimes it also made her a bit inappropriate. Right now, though, she felt like she was on a roll because her stories were drawing gasps and laughs, and the guests were pushing her to tell them more and more. But there was at least one person in the crowd that seemed bothered by what Marie was saying: the hostess of the party. The hostess kept silently glaring at Marie from the other end of the table. It was like she was silently trying to tell her to shut up. But Marie figured she knew why she was acting that way. I mean, the hostess was also a fortune teller, and so she must just be jealous. Marie's getting all this attention and potential new clients, and this wasn't even her party. Like, she just got to be jealous. So Marie ignored the glares and just kept on talking until dinner was over. And then after that, the party ended, and Marie staggered off to bed. When Marie woke up the next day, her head was absolutely pounding, and her stomach was in knots. I mean, she was severely hungover from drinking the night before. She didn't remember a whole lot about what had happened the night before, but she did remember telling a lot of stories, and she remembered that while she was telling these stories, the hostess was angrily glaring at her the whole time. And now that she was sober, a terrible thought popped into her head. She wondered if she'd said or done something that was embarrassing. What if the table wasn't laughing with her? What if they were laughing at her? And what if, the hostess glaring at her was some sort of signal to stop because she was hurting herself? And so this thought that, somehow she had done real damage to her reputation, her career, from being too drunk, continued to weigh on her throughout the entire day and into the following evening, until that night when she was in her kitchen making some dinner with her adult daughter, and there was a knock at her door. Marie hurried to open it up, and when she did, she found a young woman standing on her front steps. The woman seemed incredibly nervous and kept fidgeting and smoothing her hair. And she told Marie that she had gotten her name from someone Marie had met at that dinner party and was hoping that Marie could help her. And when she heard this, Marie smiled and exhaled out all the tension she'd been holding up over the last day. This was a huge relief to Marie. It was proof that the dinner party had not been a total embarrassment, despite the hostess glaring at her the whole time. That clearly, here she is getting a new client. She must have impressed at least this woman, and maybe there were more, like it had been a success. So very excitedly, she invited the young woman inside and led her to the area of her home where Marie conducted her business and read people's fortunes. This room had lots of strange objects placed all around it, like jars and crystals and bottles of potions and decks of cards to make the area feel mystical and authentic. The two of them eventually sat down at Marie's small table in the middle of this room, and once they were sitting, the woman told Marie that she did want her fortune told because she had a terribly abusive husband, and she wanted to know how much longer she would have to put up with his cruelty. This didn't surprise Marie. She'd seen a lot of nervous, frail women like this one who were completely trapped in their marriages. In France at this time, divorce wasn't even legal, which meant you were stuck with your partner even if they were abusive. And so a lot of these women that were in this position turned to Marie, desperate to be told what the rest of their lives looked like, and if their lives would continue to be terrible and hard because of their partner. Marie knew that really what these women were looking for was control. They hoped that if they just knew what their future looked like, even if it was bad, they could somehow do something to change it. And so Marie, she reached out and she grabbed this woman's hand and she turned it around and she began to study her palm. Marie was trying to get a sense of what the future held for this woman by reading her palm. And pretty soon, Marie got this feeling in her gut. She felt sure that this woman actually was going to be okay. and Marie told the woman that her husband's abuse would end soon. Then she gave her some tips on what to do in the meantime. The woman was visibly relieved and thanked Marie profusely, and then when she was gone, Marie smiled. Not just because she had helped this woman, but also because, after this job, Marie would only need 2 more clients before she had enough money to retire. A few days later, on January 4th, Marie woke up to somebody banging on her door. She figured it must be a very desperate client, so she rolled out of bed and started walking to go answer it. But before she could get there, the door flew open and the Parisian police poured inside. Marie staggered back and just stared at them in complete shock. She had no idea what they were doing there, but they immediately just grabbed her and said she was under arrest. Marie screamed in protest and said there had to be some mistake here. She hadn't done anything wrong. And when they didn't listen to her, she got furious and demanded to be released. She told them that she was Marie Boss, and she had friends in high places like Parliament and noble circles. They could vouch for her and say that she was an honest person who just worked hard and was good for her clients and good for the city. But as she was ranting and raving, one of the officers stepped in front of her, and without reacting to what she was saying, they just showed her an object that Marie instantly recognized as having come from her fortune-telling room. And at this, her heart sank and she stopped struggling, because Marie knew that she was now in very, very big trouble. And if she was in trouble, then so were many, many other people in Paris. After Marie was arrested, she was brought to a prison in Paris called the Bastille, where she was interrogated by torture. And since Marie was already a talker, she quickly told the police everything they wanted to know. And after Marie did that, all hell broke loose. Hordes of police officers fanned out through the whole city, charging into homes and businesses all around Paris, arresting civilians, business owners, and housewives. Then they flooded the hall of the city's government and demanded high-ranking officials in parliament surrender their wives to authorities, throwing the Parisian government into absolute chaos. And even after all of that, the authorities still weren't finished. They left the city and began forcing the French nobility out of their castles to go face charges in the city. Months turned into years, and the arrests continued to pile up, and each one was more shocking than the last, until the investigation led authorities to the actual royal palace in Paris and to the king's favorite mistress. By the time the police finished their investigation, hundreds of people all across France, ranging from commoners to literal royalty, were either facing charges or sitting in jail cells. And screams filled the halls of these prisons as the arrested were tortured for whatever information they might have. Scores of people fled the country, and then eventually, all around Paris, these enormous pyres were built in the public squares. And one by one, dozens and dozens of people were led out to these pyres, strapped to the poles in the middle of them, and then burned to death in front of thousands of Parisian spectators. And it was all because of Marie. So Marie Boss was not just a fortune teller. She made her real money by making and selling poison. And it would turn out that she was not the only one. In fact, at the time, you could say Paris basically ran on poison. Since the late 1660s, according to one estimate, around half of the people who lived in that city, from housewives to literal royalty, had poisoned someone or been poisoned by someone. It had become absurdly common for people, especially rich people, to buy poison from Marie and the network of 400 or so other poisoners around the city and use it to quietly commit murder so that the victims' deaths looked natural. But poison was not just used to kill people. It was sort of used like a solution for many kinds of problems, like people who wanted their romantic interests to be easier to seduce, well, they'd buy poison and poison them. Or people that had abusive or unappealing partners, they would use poison to make them sick and bedridden. Because remember, they can't get divorced. So if you're stuck with somebody and you don't like them, well, just poison them. It was also alleged that King Louis XIV himself was poisoned in non-fatal doses by his mistress, who wanted to make him easier to manipulate. Poison was even used for entertainment. One duo of poisoners baked deadly substances into cakes and handed them out to unsuspecting patients at a local hospital just to see what would happen. The poison affair, as it came to be called, was without a doubt at the time Paris's biggest and best kept secret, until Marie went to that dinner party, got really drunk, and let it slip. That night, Marie told stories of poisoning people, and people thought they were so funny because they didn't believe they were true. But one of the guests saw that the hostess of the party looked furious at Marie the whole time Marie was telling these stories. And so he wondered if maybe what Marie was talking about might actually be real, and the hostess is kind of trying to signal her to stop talking about it, but Marie was not taking the hint. So the following day, that dinner guest went to the police, and the police sent a woman to Marie's house to act as an undercover spy to see if maybe she could get proof that the poisonings were real. And lo and behold, when this woman told Marie that her husband was abusive and she just wanted to know how long this was going to go on for, Marie, read her palm and read her future, but then also gave her some tips about what to do in the meantime, which included handing her a vial of poison and saying, just go ahead and kill your husband, poison him. The object that officer had shown Marie when she was arrested was that poison. The investigation into the poison affair lasted for 3 years, and during that time, there were over 300 people who got arrested, from commoners to royalty. 23 of those people were banished, and 34 people were executed, including Marie Boss. She was actually the first person to be burned alive on one of those pyres. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In December of 2005, a young woman walked down a sidewalk in New York City. There were Christmas decorations on all the buildings and Christmas lights. It was very festive. But as she walked along, she glanced over at a newspaper stand, and she saw something on the front page of that paper that literally made her stop in her tracks, and not because it was festive. It was awful. Right there on the front page was a picture of the one thing in her life that she'd hoped she would never, ever see again. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, on the next extremely hot day, sneak into the like button's house and jack their thermostat all the way up to the highest setting, and then once it's there, rip the thermostat off the wall. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the evening of Sunday, November 27, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Woods leaned towards the mirror to put on her eyeliner inside the bathroom of her small apartment in New York City. Catherine's phone was sitting on the bathroom counter, and she heard it buzz, but she didn't even look to see who was calling. She didn't have time to talk to anyone, because she had to finish getting ready for her 7 o'clock shift at work. So Catherine had moved to New York City from Ohio 3 years earlier to pursue her dream of becoming a dancer on Broadway. But everything here was so expensive that in addition to chasing her dream, she also had to work 3 different jobs just to make ends meet. Now, 2 of those jobs were pretty standard. She worked as a waitress and also taught children's dance classes. But tonight, she was getting ready to go to her 3rd job, and this job was not really standard at all. In fact, to her, she was sort of embarrassed about it. And because of that, she was keeping it a secret from almost everybody in her life. Her 3rd job was working as a topless dancer at a strip club near Times Square called Flash Dancers. Catherine honestly hated the work, but it paid really well, and if she wanted to have her shot at Broadway, she needed to pay for voice lessons and dance classes. Now, she did live in Manhattan, which was the most expensive part of the already very expensive city, and she knew that she could save some money if she just moved to a neighborhood where rent was cheaper. But when she had first moved to New York, she had lived in a less expensive neighborhood for that reason, and unfortunately, her landlord had sexually assaulted her. The experience had been so traumatic that Catherine had, at the time, considered just leaving New York and going back to Ohio and just being done with this place. But in the end, she had decided to stay in New York and continue chasing her dream. Now, she did move within New York. She'd gotten this apartment in Manhattan because it was a lot safer. And she also got a roommate to help with the cost. His name was David Hahn. He was 23, and he was one of Catherine's friends from back home in Ohio. But at this very moment, David was not inside the apartment. He'd gone outside to get his car so he could drive Catherine to work. Catherine finished her makeup and left the bathroom, and as she walked through the living room, she stepped over a black dog that was sleeping on the floor. The dog was not Catherine's, and it actually was not David's either. David was a part-time dog sitter, so this dog was just staying with them while its owners were out of town. Just like Catherine, David also had a bunch of part-time jobs to help make ends meet. When he wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a hotel just up the street from their apartment. Now, Catherine and David had actually been romantic at one point. They had dated for a little while, but these days they were just roommates, living together to split the bills. Although, secretly, Catherine did sometimes wonder if, maybe they should give it another shot to try being a couple again. Thanksgiving had been a few days ago, and instead of going home to Ohio like she usually did, Catherine had stayed in New York and celebrated with David, and it had been a really nice time. Plus, David knew about Catherine's third job of working at Flash Dancers, and he didn't judge her for it, and Catherine felt like a lot of people did, so she liked that about him. But the biggest hurdle that Catherine could see to potentially rekindling their relationship was the fact that David disliked basically every man she met. Whether she was dating them or not, he just did not like them. Now, some of these guys, she could understand why David, didn't like them. Like there was this guy, Joe, that she had dated briefly, who really she'd only met because he was a patron of her strip club. But then there were people like Paul, who was a personal trainer at Catherine's gym, who she'd only seen off and on, and who was nothing but nice to David. And even though Paul and Catherine were not dating now and mostly just spoke on the phone periodically, David still insisted that Paul was a creep. He just did not like the guy. But for now, Catherine figured, you know what, I'm not going to figure out my entire romantic life. I just need to finish getting ready and go downstairs so she wouldn't keep David waiting. So Catherine went into her bedroom and began getting dressed. And that's when she heard that dog start barking at something in the living room. And so, curious, Catherine walked in that direction to see what was going on. A little while later, Catherine's roommate, David, walked quickly along the sidewalk to get his car, which was parked a ways up the street. He was out of breath by the time he reached it. He knew he had to hurry, so he jumped in and he drove back to the apartment building and he called Catherine as he pulled up out front. When she didn't answer, he threw on his hazards and he climbed back out to go into the building to go get her. And he had just made it up the flight of stairs that led to his second floor apartment and he was going down the hallway when he saw something that made him come to an abrupt stop. It was that black dog that he was dog sitting. Somehow, it had gotten out of the apartment and was just standing there in the shared hallway outside of his apartment door. David blinked and then realized that his neighbor, a man he rarely interacted with named Brad Stewart, was standing right behind the dog. And Brad was holding a leash that was clearly clipped onto the dog's collar. For a second, Brad looked surprised, and David was just completely confused about why this guy had the dog that he was dog sitting on a leash. But then Brad told David that he had found the dog wandering around, recognized it as David's, and brought it back to his apartment. Brad said he had just knocked on David's apartment door, but so far nobody had answered. So at this point, David understood, why Brad has the dog, but he didn't know why the dog was out of the apartment in the first place. But he kept that to himself and just thanked Brad, took the leash, and then stepped over to the door of his apartment, number 2D. The apartment door was shut, but when he turned the handle, he found that it was unlocked. David couldn't remember if he had left it unlocked or not, so he just opened it, and he called out Catherine's name. But there was no answer, which was weird, so he stepped inside. Now, he didn't see Catherine, but he did see the door to her bedroom was slightly cracked open, so he walked over to it, and he called out to her again. And then when she didn't call back, he tried pushing her door open. But the door didn't really open. It instead swung maybe a few inches and then stopped. And David felt resistance on the other side, like something maybe on the ground was holding the door from opening all the way. And so now, with all these strange things happening, David's starting to feel pretty worried. And so the surge of adrenaline came over him, and he just shoved the door open, and he stuck his head in, and he looked inside. And when he saw what was in there, he immediately pulled back, turned around, ran into the hallway, and he called the police. A half an hour later, around 7:30 p.m., an NYPD detective named Stephen Getz walked up a flight of stairs at an apartment building in Manhattan. This part of the city was known to be extremely safe. Homicides never really happened here, But if the 911 caller had been telling the truth, Getz knew that a potential grisly murder scene was in fact waiting for him in apartment 2D. When he reached the second floor landing, he saw there were already a few other NYPD officers on the scene, and one of them was speaking to this young, skinny guy standing in the hallway who looked really upset, and he was holding a leash that was connected to a black dog. Another officer walked over to Getz and filled him in. He said the man that was being spoken to was the victim's roommate, David Hahn, and he was the one who had found the body and called 911. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment in the back bedroom. Getz nodded and then walked down the hallway, past David and the dog, toward the apartment door. His plan was to look at the scene himself before he began questioning anyone. Getz put on some disposable rubber gloves and checked out the door frame to the actual apartment, and then he also looked at the door itself. But he didn't see any damage that could signify forced entry. So he stepped into the apartment, and he saw that the small living room was a little bit messy. But it wasn't like it had been ransacked or something. The futon was pulled out and there were some men's clothes strewn around, but it sort of looked like a typical place that people lived. And so Getz walked through the living room, being careful not to disturb anything, and he went towards what he assumed was the bedroom, where the body was. The door was open just wide enough that Getz was able to get through. And when he stepped through and was inside the room, he saw blood everywhere. It was all over the walls and the furniture, and the room itself looked like it had been completely torn apart. One of the dresser drawers was open, and lots of women's clothing was scattered all over the place, and the mattress had been completely taken off the bed frame and was now lying on the floor, and that's actually what was blocking the door from opening all the way. And then, in the middle of the room, in a pool of blood, lay the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her for a closer look. She was wearing a t-shirt and underwear, and the t-shirt had a very obvious shoe print on it, like whoever had killed Catherine had stepped on her. And there were at least a dozen stab wounds all over her body. There were also what appeared to be defensive wounds on her hands and arms, which Getz knew meant she must have fought back against her attacker. But the worst injuries she sustained were definitely to her neck. Whoever had killed her had slit her throat so deeply that they had almost decapitated her. And so to Getz, right away, it seemed like whoever killed Catherine had been in an absolute rage. At that point, Getz heard footsteps coming from behind him, and he stood up and he turned around to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. Now, the blocked door was making maneuvering in and out of this bedroom pretty difficult, so one of the first things the forensics team did was to pick up the mattress and carefully lean it against the wall, so the bedroom door could now swing open all the way. Then Detective Getz just stepped back and let the forensics team get to work. He watched as they pulled that shoe print off the t-shirt Catherine was wearing, and then also there was a second identical shoe print that was on her bed sheets that they also grabbed. To Getz, both of these prints did appear to be from the exact same shoe, and to the naked eye, these prints appeared, at least to Getz, to belong to very likely an average-sized man. Detective Getz was immediately curious about something, so he stepped out of the bedroom into the living room, and he quickly found a couple pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor. And although the tread of these shoes did not match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom, they did appear to be the exact same size. An hour later, at about 8:30 p.m. on November 27, 2005, Detective Getz sat down at a table inside of an interview room at the NYPD's 19th Precinct. And once he did, he handed a bottle of water across the table to David Hahn, the roommate of the murder victim, and Detective Getz' current number one suspect. There had been no sign of forced entry at the apartment that David and Catherine shared, which meant that Catherine's killer either had access to the apartment or was let inside by somebody who did. And the murder had been committed with a knife in a really savage way that struck Getz as being a personally motivated attack. Even though Catherine's bedroom had been trashed, nothing seemed to have been stolen, and because Catherine had been found partially undressed, there was potentially a sexual motive at play as well. So Getz's working theory here was that this murder was committed by a man who knew the victim well and had easy access to her living space. And David fit that profile to a T. Plus, he apparently wore the same size shoe as the killer. Although, as Detective Getz settled into his chair and brought out his notepad, he did a quick scan of David's forearms and his hands, and he saw that David had no visible cuts, scrapes, or bruises. The detective thought that Catherine's killer likely would have some injuries there because she had obviously been fighting for her life. She would have left a mark on them. But Getz didn't say anything about this to David. Instead, he just leaned forward and he asked David to walk him through what had happened that day. David's hands were shaking a bit, but he took a deep breath to calm himself, and he said that he had been at the apartment with Catherine that night until about 6:40 p.m. That was when he had left to go get his car so he could come back and drive Catherine to her 7 o'clock shift at Flash Dancers. But he said retrieving his car had taken longer than he expected, because on the way, he had run into some of his coworkers from his doorman job, and he had stopped to chat with them. He said after he had done that and he had gotten his car and he went back to the apartment, he had expected Catherine to be waiting outside by the curb. But when he got there, there was no sign of her, and she didn't answer when he called her. So David said he'd ultimately gone inside and ran upstairs to the apartment, and in the hallway he had found his neighbor, Brad, who was oddly holding the leash of the black dog that David was supposed to be looking after. And then David said he went into his apartment, and that's when he found Catherine's body. David said he had called 911 right away. It was right around 7 p.m. And at this, Getz stopped writing on the notepad and just looked up at David. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he'd only been out of the apartment for 20 minutes, and that in that narrow window of time, Catherine had been brutally murdered and the killer had also escaped. It honestly sounded like one of the worst alibis Getz had ever heard. But he didn't want David to know just how close he was to getting arrested for murder, because he didn't want David to get scared and stop talking. So Getz kept his tone very sympathetic as he asked how long David had known Catherine for. David said they had met back in Ohio a few years ago while Catherine was visiting her hometown. They'd begun dating, and he had ultimately moved out to New York to live with her. But it wasn't long before Catherine broke up with him and then asked him to move out. But David said he had not been able to afford his own place, so he had started sleeping in his car. And Catherine had felt bad about that, so she had ultimately let him move back in on the condition that he slept on the futon out in the living room. By now, Detective Getz's pen was flying across the page, because David was not just Catherine's roommate, he was her ex-boyfriend. An ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see Catherine alive and discovered her body. Getz was more confident than ever that he was sitting across from Catherine's killer. He told David that everything he was saying was incredibly helpful, but right now, he needed to go check on something. David agreed to wait, and Getz stood up to leave. But he stopped at the door, and he asked David for one last thing before he left. He asked what his shoe size was. And without missing a beat, David answered that he wore a 10.5. Getz jotted this down, and then he left. What he hadn't told David was the reason he was stepping out of the room was to go get some information from the NYPD's forensics team and the uniformed officers who were currently questioning David's neighbors. And once Getz had that information, he was going to use it to try to catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, so about 3 p.m. the next day, Getz was sitting at his desk feeling completely exhausted, but was pounding yet another cup of coffee. He'd been up all night interrogating David, who was still literally sitting right down the hall in the interrogation room. And also, Getz had been going back and forth with the forensics team and other officers and detectives who were out in the neighborhood, and he still had loads more to do before he could finally go to sleep. Right now, Getz was going over a new batch of reports from the uniformed officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building, asking the neighbors if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. And just like Getz had hoped, the information they were getting did contradict pieces of David's story. David claimed that he had left the apartment at about 6:40 p.m. and said that at that time, Catherine was fine. But two neighbors said they heard screams coming from the apartment before 6:40 p.m. The man in the unit directly above David and Catherine said he had heard 3 screams at 6:28 p.m. And the people in the unit next door to David and Catherine said they'd heard screaming, barking, and the sound of furniture moving around even earlier, between 5:45 and 6 p.m. Now, none of these neighbors had done anything about these noises because the noises had stopped pretty quickly. And then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had said he had found the black dog. Brad told police that when he ran into David in the hallway, it was sometime between 6 and 6:30. But David had said that he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body at about 7 p.m., a full half hour later. Now, Getz knew witnesses were often bad with time, and in a dense New York City apartment building, there were lots of noises coming from lots of units. But still, it looked to him like David's alibi had serious problems. And so the detective sat back and had some more coffee, and then his phone rang. He picked it up, and it was the forensics team with an update about those shoe prints that were on Catherine's shirt and the bedsheets. And the prints were indeed left behind by a roughly average-sized man. They were a men's size 10.5. And this was the exact size Getz knew David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and then rushed back to the interrogation room to have yet another chat with David Hahn. This time, though, Getz did not offer David a water. He just sat down and he confronted him with all these new facts. He told David that the killer's shoe prints were exactly his shoe size, that his neighbors had heard screams before David had supposedly left the building, and that Brad said he'd seen David in the hallway at least a half an hour earlier than David had claimed he was there. Getz leaned in and told David that there were also security cameras in the apartment building, and his officers were already in the process of getting access to that footage. So if David had anything to say, he better say it now. Getz watched as David's expression went from exhausted to clearly afraid. It seemed like this might be the first time that David realized the police truly did not believe his story. And after a second of just stunned silence, David insisted that he had not killed Catherine, and he begged Getz to believe him. But when Getz just glared back at him completely unmoved, David launched into a whole new story, one he had not mentioned at all over the last 20 hours of interrogation. David said Catherine knew this guy named Paul Cortez. She had dated him, but David had always thought he was kind of a creep. And David said Catherine had told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So David said the police really ought to go investigate Paul, not him. To Getz, this seemed like a desperate last-minute attempt to cast suspicion on somebody else. But he knew he did have to follow every lead, so he did write down Paul's name and told David they'd look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the evening, David was still in the interrogation room, and reporters from all the daily papers were beginning to assemble right outside. The following morning, the story of Catherine's murder and pictures of her smiling face were all over the news. The front page of the New York Daily News carried a headline that made Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper." Inside, the article reported that Catherine's family hadn't known she was working as a topless dancer until they literally flew to the city from Ohio to collect her body. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He wasn't convinced that Catherine's line of work had anything to do with her murder, but the papers seemed intent on running with it. And a media circus was like the last thing Getz wanted. His team was already under enough pressure to make an arrest as it was. And it was going to be even harder to do their jobs now that a bunch of tips were going to be flooding in from the public from all this media. Getz put down the newspaper, got up from his desk, and walked down the hall to the interrogation room. He'd finished the day yesterday feeling pretty confident that David was his murderer. So when he'd sent David home, he had given him instructions not to leave the city, because he intended to arrest David, and soon. But first, Getz did need to follow up on the other leads he had, to hopefully rule them out. And one of those leads was sitting in the interrogation room right now waiting for him. It was Paul Cortez, the man that David had named, who officers had tracked down and brought in, the man who supposedly was obsessed with Catherine. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was look at Paul's shoes, and he could see that they were a pretty typical size too. At a glance, they looked like they could also be a 10.5. Getz also looked for scratches or bruises on Paul's skin, in particular on his forearms and his hands. And he did see one. There was a small injury on one of Paul's fingertips. Getz asked about it, and Paul said his finger had just gotten pinched between a couple of weights at the gym. Paul was very calm and soft-spoken, and he said he'd heard all about Catherine's death in the papers, and he just wanted to help if he could. When Getz told him that they'd gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just kind of rolled his eyes and said, David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine. Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago, and they'd been dating off and on ever since. At the time of Catherine's death, he said they had been off, but Paul said he still cared about her and had hoped that maybe one day they might get back together. Paul told Getz that he hadn't actually seen Catherine on the day of her death, but that he had actually spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon, which was not unusual. The two did speak on the phone from time to time. That's all it was. Paul said he actually had tried calling her a second time that day, but she didn't answer. But Paul said he really didn't think much of it. And then Paul said that night he wound up going shopping with some friends and then also to a local bar to watch the Jets game at about 8:30. Getz made a note to follow up on Paul's alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might have killed Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes lit up, and he said there had been some stalker guy named Joe who'd been one of Catherine's regulars at the strip club. Months ago, he'd somehow gotten Catherine's phone number and had reached out to her outside of the club. And around that same time, Catherine had actually gotten roofied during one of her strip club shifts. A roofie is called the date rape drug. It basically makes you incapacitated and effectively unconscious. You don't remember anything. People will be given a roofie and then be sexually assaulted. That's often its use. And even though he'd never been able to prove this, Paul always suspected it had been Joe who gave Catherine that roofie. Catherine had cut off contact with Joe, but the whole incident had bothered Paul so much that he tried to convince Catherine to just quit the exotic dancing scene, but she refused. Paul admitted that he actually went on to call Catherine's father to tell him how worried he was about her. And Catherine had been so mad about that she stopped talking to Paul for weeks. And so Getz jotted all this down and then asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this guy Joe. Paul said he didn't have Joe's number, but it was definitely in Catherine's phone. Because the last time Paul ever spoke on the phone with Catherine, on the afternoon of her death, she had mentioned something that really surprised him. She said that after months of silence, Joe had started calling her again, completely out of the blue. And at this, Getz studied Paul's face, looking for any hint of deception. This whole Joe story seemed like it might just be a way to deflect suspicion from Paul himself. But it really didn't feel like Paul was lying here. And besides, Catherine's phone records would be simple enough to verify. Getz hated to admit it, but maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe it was time he started looking seriously into some of Catherine's customers at the strip club. The following afternoon, on Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was feeling really annoyed as he hung up the phone at his desk. It had been a call from another reporter, but Getz hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was staying tight-lipped. But for now, he just turned his focus back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he'd subpoenaed yesterday, and they showed that Paul had been telling the truth. Both he and Joe had called Catherine shortly before she died. So he'd brought in Joe for an interview, and he asked him to explain why, after months of silence, he had called Catherine right before she turned up dead. And Joe had replied he'd only called her to check in, to say he hoped she had a nice Thanksgiving. He had claimed that he was really just trying to be friendly. But then Getz just asked Joe point blank if he had ever roofied anyone's drink before. And at this, Joe's eyes went wide and he kind of sputtered out that he would never dream of doing anything like that. But based on Joe's tone, Getz really felt like he was lying. And so now, Getz felt like the entire investigation was wide open. A few days ago, he had been absolutely confident that David was the killer. But men from Catherine's life just kept coming out of the woodwork. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just 1. In fact, at this point, his original suspect, David, was actually looking more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's coworkers at the hotel where he worked as a doorman, and they confirmed that he really had stopped and talked to them on the evening of Catherine's death, just like he had claimed. And while Getz had hoped that the security camera footage from the apartment building would prove David was lying about his alibi, at least in terms of when he was there, it actually showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38 p.m., which lined up with David's story because he said he left around 6:40. Now, this did not prove that David was innocent. Based on what the neighbors had heard, she could have been killed before 6:38, but there weren't a lot of cameras in the apartment building, and no angle covered the hallway outside of apartment 2D. So the footage couldn't prove one way or another, whether Brad Stewart or anybody else for that matter had gone into the apartment while David was gone. Just then, his phone rang. Getz reached for it, expecting it to be another reporter, but this time he was pleasantly surprised. It was a member of the forensics team, and there was this obvious excitement in their voice. He told Getz that they'd just discovered something big, something they completely missed during their first sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensics team member explained that when they'd first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had taken that mattress that was stuck behind the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But when they'd done that, the mattress had actually covered up something that was right there on the wall all along. A bloody handprint. It was not until a couple of days later, after they'd carefully gone over everything else in the room, that they moved the mattress back down onto the floor, and that's when they found the handprint. Getz's face lit up when he heard this news, because now he knew all he had to do was go get handprints from all of his suspects, which seemed like that would be pretty easy to do. But he quickly realized he had a problem, because some of his suspects had already lawyered up at this point, and they were refusing to speak with police, let alone hand over their prints. And Getz really could not force them to give their prints unless he arrested them. And so that meant Getz was now in this weird catch-22, because he needed the suspects' prints in order to make the arrest, but he also couldn't get their prints unless he arrested them. So at this point, the investigation kind of stalled out. Weeks went by, and Detective Getz started to get really frustrated because there was just nothing he could legally do to push the case forward. However, the case was still receiving a ton of coverage in the press, and to a lot of people, it looked like the NYPD was just sort of dropping the ball here. But then on December 16th, so 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the news coverage that had annoyed Getz so much actually ended up giving him exactly what he needed. That day, a woman called the NYPD because of something she had seen on the front page of one of the newspapers in New York. And what this woman said led Getz directly to Catherine's killer. Based on forensic evidence and numerous interviews, this is what police believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of November 27, 2005. Shortly after 6:40 p.m., the killer climbed the stairs inside of Catherine's apartment building. They knew that at that very moment, she'd be getting ready for another shift at Flash Dancers. And the fact that she even worked there secretly really bothered the killer way more than they would ever let on. The idea of Catherine dancing and giving her attention to other men made the killer so jealous they couldn't even stand it. Now, the killer had tried to talk with Catherine and win her over, but she had rejected him. So the time for talking was over. And so the killer quietly walked up to the door of apartment 2D and reached down and turned the handle, which was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, the killer brought out the knife that they had hidden inside of their sweatshirt. But then something they had not anticipated happened. There was this dog lying on the apartment floor that got up and began to bark at them. For a moment, the killer thought about just abandoning the plan and leaving, but then Catherine, alerted by the dog, came out of the bedroom and looked right at the killer and saw the knife in their hand. Catherine screamed and ran right back into her bedroom, the very bedroom that she had made explicitly off limits to the killer. And just thinking about that, the surge of anger suddenly overtook them, and the killer charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the other side of the bed, lifting up the mattress as a sort of barricade, but the killer just forced their way past it and they grabbed Catherine from behind. But Catherine, she fought back. She began thrashing around, doing everything she could to break free. But she couldn't, and so they struggled and began smashing into the furniture and knocking things down all over the room. And it was around this point that the killer lifted up that knife they had brought and they slit her neck as deep as they could. But even then, even with this fatal wound, Catherine kept on fighting. And she was so vicious that the killer actually had to brace themselves against a wall just to keep their balance. And in the chaos, the killer didn't realize, as they're fighting off Catherine, that they had placed a bloody hand on the wall, leaving a print behind. Finally, when Catherine fell to the floor, the killer was still blinded with their rage, and they just got down there and began stabbing her over and over again. And then finally, when Catherine stopped moving, the killer just jumped up and ran out of the apartment. But when they got into the hallway, they realized that black dog that had barked at them had gotten out. Now, the killer wanted the dog back in the apartment, but the dog was clearly on edge. They were still barking at the killer. And so instead, the killer just shut the apartment door, trapping the dog in the hallway. And then the killer fled the apartment building out the back door, where there was no security camera. And for weeks, the killer was not caught, until their violent past came back to bite them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who didn't know Catherine was walking down the streets of New York when she noticed a newspaper. and on the cover of this newspaper was plastered the face of the killer, who was currently a suspect in a murder case. And this woman was horrified because she knew this person. They, the killer, had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier, but she had never filed a police report. But after seeing that this horrible person was being actively accused of murder, she called the NYPD and she told them what she knew. And the NYPD's Special Victims Unit used this woman's accusation as the basis to arrest the killer. And finally, once they were under arrest, Getz was able to get their handprint. And those prints did in fact match the bloody handprint found on Catherine's wall. They belonged to Catherine's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Paul Cortez. David's suspicions of Paul had been right all along. Paul was a creep who had assaulted at least one other woman before he killed Catherine. Data collected from nearby cell towers would prove that Paul was near Catherine's apartment building immediately before her murder, and he had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, Paul waited until he saw David leave the apartment to go get his car, and then he hustled upstairs to the apartment, knowing Catherine would be alone. Even though David was only gone for 20 minutes, that was still long enough for Paul to get inside the apartment, murder Catherine, and slip away unnoticed. Paul was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder on Wednesday, December 23, 2005. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.